"Get out!" my brother hissed, dragging my suitcase across the porch while our mother's funeral flowers were still fresh in the living room. I thought I had lost my home, my family, and every memory I had left in the world. But at the will reading 3 weeks later, the lawyer opened one single sealed envelope, and my brother completely stopped breathing. Before I tell you what was inside that envelope and how it changed my entire life, please take a second to like this video and subscribe if you enjoy stories about family secrets and justice. Drop a comment right now to let me know where you are watching from and what time it is there. I love reading your responses. Now let me take you back to the afternoon the nightmare began. My name is Harper. I am 29 years old and I work from home as a medical biller. Up until last month, my entire universe revolved around the small, quiet suburban house I shared with my mother, Barbara. I had spent the last 5 years working from my laptop at the kitchen table, balancing medical billing codes and complex insurance claims while managing her medications, her endless doctor appointments, and her slowly declining health. The day of her funeral was a devastating blur of cold rain, empty sympathetic murmurs from extended relatives, and an exhausting hollow grief that settled deep in my bones. When I finally returned to the house after the burial service, the silence in the hallways was absolutely suffocating. The heavy scent of white lilies and damp earth clung to my black mourning dress. I stood alone in the center of the living room, my feet aching in cheap black heels, feeling like the ground had been pulled out from under me. My hands were trembling as I picked up a silver-framed photograph of my mom from the fireplace mantel. It was taken on my high school graduation day. She was smiling so brightly, looking so full of life and health. I traced the glass over her face, feeling the hot tears finally start to spill over my eyelashes and run down my cheeks. I just wanted a single moment to breathe, to say a private goodbye to the woman who had been my absolute best friend and my entire world. But I did not even get 5 minutes of peace. The front door violently slammed open, rattling the picture frames on the walls and shattering the quiet. My older brother Declan marched into the living room. He was 33 years old and still wearing his expensive, tailored funeral suit. But his tie was already ripped off, and his expression was cold and calculating. He marched straight past me, clutching a fistful of heavy-duty black garbage bags. He did not say a single word to me at first. He just marched across the hardwood floor, his heavy footsteps echoing in the painfully quiet house, and snatched the silver frame right out of my hands. The sudden violent force of it made me gasp out loud. My fingers scraped against the sharp metal edge of the frame as he ripped it away, tossing it onto the wooden coffee table with a careless, heavy thud. The glass did not break, but the sharp sound of it hitting the wood felt like a physical blow in the silent room. I stood there paralyzed by the sheer disrespect of the gesture, staring at my older brother in absolute disbelief. We had just buried our mother 3 hours ago. The damp earth on her grave was not even settled yet. The priest had barely finished giving his final blessing. Before I could even process the shock of what he had just done, Declan held out his open palm toward me. "Give me the house keys, Harper," he demanded. His voice was not thick with grief or sorrow or mourning. It was sharp, impatient, and completely devoid of any human warmth. I blinked my exhausted brain, struggling to catch up with his cruel words. I asked him what he was talking about. I told him we needed to sit down, that we needed to rest, that it had been a tremendously long and emotionally devastating day. But he just stepped closer, towering over me, his face hardening into a bitter scowl. "I am not asking you again," he said, his tone dropping into a low, threatening register. "Give me the keys to the front door, the back door, and the garage. You are done here. You are." I shook my head, my initial confusion rapidly giving way to a rising, suffocating panic in my chest. I told him this was my home. I reminded him that I had lived here for 5 consecutive years. I had given up my comfortable apartment in the city, paused my entire social life, and moved back into my childhood bedroom, specifically so I could be here around the clock. I was the one who cooked her pureed meals, managed her complex pain medication schedules, bathed her when she became too weak to stand on her own, and held her hand through every agonizing, sleepless night. I did all of that while he was out living his best life, taking luxury networking vacations in Miami, and actively ignoring my desperate phone calls when she was declining. I told him he had absolutely no legal or moral right to walk in here and demand my keys. He just scoffed a cruel, dismissive sound that made the blood run freezing cold in my veins. Before Declan could offer a reply, the sharp, rhythmic click of designer heels echoed from the front hallway. Jasmine walked into the living room, and suddenly the oppressive, mournful atmosphere of the house shifted into something entirely corporate and sterile. Jasmine was Declan's wife of 2 years. She was a stunning, fiercely ambitious African-American real estate agent who always looked like she had just stepped directly off the cover of a high-fashion business magazine. Today was certainly no exception. Despite having just attended a somber funeral service, she was wearing an immaculate, form-fitting black designer dress that looked far more appropriate for an exclusive downtown cocktail party than a day of deep family mourning. Her hair was styled in flawless, sleek waves, and her posture radiated absolute, unwavering confidence. But the most jarring detail was the glowing tablet she held securely in her left hand. She was not crying. She was not grieving. She was actively tapping the illuminated screen, her eyes darting quickly around the living room, taking calculated, predatory measurements of the walls and the floor space. She had married my brother under the strict assumption that he was the golden heir to a massive suburban real estate empire. She saw my mother's terminal illness not as a family tragedy, but as a ticking clock toward a massive financial payday. She glided across the room, completely ignoring my tear-stained face and shaking hands, and stopped near the brick fireplace. She tapped her screen with a perfectly manicured fingernail. "We are going to have to rip out this entire mantle," she announced to Declan, speaking as if I were absolutely invisible. "It is completely dated. And the affluent buyers in this zip code are looking for modern, minimalist finishes. We need to schedule the luxury contractors to come in first thing Monday morning to knock down that partition wall in the kitchen." I stood there, my mouth hanging open in absolute, unadulterated horror. I found my voice and asked her what on earth she was doing. I pointed to the beautiful floral funeral arrangements, the stack of sympathy cards resting on the kitchen counter, the heavy medical equipment that had not even been picked up by the hospital supply company yet. I asked how she could possibly be talking about contractors' renovations and open houses right now. Jasmine finally turned to look at me, and her expression was an absolute masterclass in condescension. She sighed a delicate, practiced sound of fake sympathy and offered me a tight smile that did not reach her cold, calculating eyes. "Look, Harper," she said, her voice smooth and entirely devoid of genuine emotion. "I know this is a difficult day for you, but we all have to move forward. The housing market is exceptionally hot right now, and we simply cannot afford to sit on this property and let it depreciate while you wallow in your feelings." I felt a hot, blinding wave of pure anger rush up my neck. I told her this was not just a piece of property to be flipped for a quick commission. I told her this was my mother's home, the safe house I had grown up in. The house I had basically turned into a full-time hospice center for the last half-decade. I turned back to my brother, begging him to talk some sense into his wife, begging him to give me at least one single week to process the massive earth-shattering loss we had just endured. Instead, Declan crossed his arms over his broad chest and stood firmly shoulder to shoulder with Jasmine. They looked like a united front, a hostile corporate takeover team, standing right in the middle of my living room. Jasmine took a step closer to me, her expensive designer perfume completely masking the lingering scent of the funeral lilies. Her voice dropped, taking on a firm, authoritative tone that she undoubtedly used to intimidate clients and close multi-million-dollar deals. "Harper, you are being incredibly selfish right now," she said smoothly. "Declan and I are trying to manage a very complex estate transition. Frankly, your emotional presence here is disrupting our grieving process. We need a clean slate to stage the property properly, and we absolutely cannot do that with you taking up the primary guest suite and crying over old photographs. You need to vacate the premises immediately." I literally could not believe the audacious words coming out of her mouth. She was genuinely accusing me of disrupting their grieving process. Declan had not visited our dying mother in 4 entire months. Jasmine had not sent so much as a cheap get-well card. They had contributed absolutely nothing to her care, her comfort, or her daily survival. I was the one who had sacrificed my entire 20s to make sure our mother did not die alone in a sterile medical facility. Now, less than a single day after she was put into the cold ground, they were treating me like an unwanted squatter who was ruining their shiny real estate portfolio. I stood my ground. I squared my shoulders, looking my brother directly in the eye. I told him I was not going anywhere. I told him I had established legal residency, that all my belongings were here, and that he could not legally force me out onto the street without serving me proper written notice. I told him I would call the local police if I had to. That was when Declan's demeanor shifted from cold impatience to absolute unhinged rage. He did not argue with me anymore. He did not try to reason with me. He simply turned around, marched violently down the hallway, and kicked open the closed door to my bedroom. I ran after him, shouting his name, demanding that he get out of my private space. He ignored me completely. He grabbed my large canvas suitcase from the top shelf of the closet, threw it roughly onto the floor, and began wildly shoving my personal belongings into it. He grabbed huge handfuls of my work clothes, my sweaters, my shoes, dumping them haphazardly into the bag without a shred of care or respect. When I frantically reached out to grab his arm, to physically stop him from violating my space and destroying my things, he shoved me backward so hard that I stumbled and hit my left shoulder painfully against the wooden doorframe. "You do not dictate the legal terms here," he hissed, his face twisted in a vicious, ugly sneer. "This is my house now. You are just the free in-house nurse, and your services are no longer required." He zipped the overstuffed suitcase shut, grabbed it tightly by the handle, and dragged it down the hallway. The heavy plastic wheels scraped violently against the polished hardwood floors, leaving long, faint scratches in the wood my mother used to polish every Sunday. I followed him, sobbing openly now, begging him to stop, pleading with him to just give me one single night to figure things out and find a place to go. Jasmine simply stood by the front door, holding it wide open, watching the entire pathetic scene unfold with a serene, unbothered expression, looking like she was simply observing a minor pest removal service. Outside, the dark sky had broken completely open. A heavy, freezing rain was pouring down in thick sheets, soaking the wooden porch and completely washing away the last fading light of the day. Declan dragged my heavy suitcase right across the threshold and hurled it out into the raging storm. It landed with a loud, heavy splash in a deep puddle on the concrete walkway, instantly soaking the fabric. I ran out onto the porch, instinctively reaching for my ruined belongings. The freezing rain immediately soaked right through my thin black morning dress, chilling me to the absolute bone. I turned around my wet hair, plastered to my face, to plead with him one last desperate time, but Declan was already standing safely inside the warm, brightly lit foyer. He looked down at me, his expression entirely devoid of any brotherly love, sympathy, or basic human decency. "Get out," he said, his voice hard, flat, and final, "and do not ever come back to my property." He slammed the heavy wooden door shut right in my face. I heard the heavy metal deadbolt click loudly into place. The sound echoed sharply over the pouring rain. I stood there alone on the porch, shivering uncontrollably in the freezing downpour, staring blankly at the closed door of the only safe home I had left in the world. The funeral flowers were still sitting on the kitchen counter inside. My mother's comforting scent was still lingering in the hallways. I was 29 years old, totally and completely alone, and I had just lost my family to my home, and every memory I had left in the world. I wrapped my arms tightly around myself, listening to the relentless rain beating against the roof, completely unaware that the darkest days of my life were only just beginning. I drove blindly for what felt like hours, though the glowing dashboard clock told me it had only been 25 minutes since my brother locked me out. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached, turning stark white under the dim streetlights, but I could not stop my body from shivering violently. The heater in my 12-year-old sedan was completely broken. blowing nothing but a pathetic stream of lukewarm air against my soaking wet clothes. The freezing rain from the porch had saturated my black morning dress all the way to the seams. The cheap fabric clung to my skin like a suffocating layer of ice. Every time I blinked my burning eyes, I saw the heavy wooden door of my childhood home slamming shut. I saw my brother's face, completely devoid of any remorse, looking down at me, like I was a worthless stranger who had just wandered off the street to beg for scraps. I pulled into the cracked, uneven asphalt parking lot of a cheap motel right off the interstate. The flickering red neon vacancy sign buzzed loudly overhead, casting a harsh, artificial glow through the rain-streaked windshield. I threw the car into park and just sat there in the darkness, listening to the relentless, heavy drumming of the rain against the metal roof. I was 29 years old. I had a solid degree in medical billing. I had spent the last 5 years of my life being a dedicated full-time caregiver to my terminally ill mother. And now I was sitting in a dark, unsafe parking lot with absolutely nowhere to go. My teeth were chattering so aggressively that my jaw ached with a dull, throbbing pain. I leaned my wet forehead against the cold steering wheel and closed my eyes, trying desperately to force steady oxygen into my lungs. I just needed to get inside somewhere safe. I needed to pay for a cheap room, take a scalding hot shower to stop the shaking, and figure out how I was going to survive the next 24 hours without falling completely apart. I reached into my damp purse with numb, fumbling fingers and pulled out my phone. The screen illuminated the cramped, freezing interior of my car. My battery was sitting at exactly 14%. I opened my mobile banking app with a familiar, deeply ingrained sense of routine. For 5 agonizing years, I had managed every single aspect of my mother's complex finances. When the doctors first gave us her terminal diagnosis, we immediately opened a joint caregiving account. I deposited every spare dollar I earned from my remote medical billing jobs directly into that specific fund to cover her exorbitant out-of-pocket medical expenses, her specialized weekly physical therapy sessions, and the incredibly expensive liquid nutrition cases she needed when she could no longer swallow solid food. I had completely drained my own small personal savings account years ago just to keep that joint medical fund healthy and afloat. I never once complained about the financial burden. I never once called my brother to ask for a single dime of help. Declan was always too busy chasing his next big real estate venture or flying to exclusive, high-profile networking events across the country to bother himself with the tedious, ugly reality of our mother's declining health. I took a deep, shuddering breath, wiping a stray cold raindrop from the glass phone screen and tapped the login button. I knew exactly how much money was supposed to be sitting in that account. Just last week, I had carefully calculated the balance to be roughly $32,450. It was money specifically meant to cover her final month of hospice care, the expensive funeral arrangements we had just completed today, and a small necessary safety net for me to restart my empty life once she was finally gone. The banking app took a painfully long moment to load, the little blue circle spinning endlessly on the screen while the winter storm raged outside my car windows. I unbuckled my seatbelt, already mentally practicing what to say to the night clerk at the front desk. I just wanted a clean bed. I just wanted to sleep and momentarily forget the brutal humiliation of my brother and his wife, tossing my suitcase onto the concrete like actual garbage. The screen finally refreshed and the account balances appeared in bold text. I stared at the numbers. I blinked hard, rubbing my tired, burning eyes, absolutely certain that the harsh neon light from the motel sign was simply playing cruel tricks on my exhausted vision. The available balance on the joint caregiving account did not say $32,000. The bold black numbers on the glowing white screen read exactly $0.00. A cold, suffocating wave of pure, unadulterated panic washed over my entire body, freezing the blood in my veins. I tapped the screen repeatedly, my heart hammering wildly against my ribcage. I refreshed the app over and over again, praying to any higher power that would listen, that this was simply a technical glitch, a server error, a temporary banking mistake that could be easily fixed in the morning. But the numbers absolutely did not change. The account was completely, utterly empty. Every single dollar was gone. My breathing turned incredibly shallow and rapid. I forced my shaking index finger to tap on the transaction history tab. The screen loaded a new page. Right at the very top of the ledger, marked with a glaring red arrow indicating a massive withdrawal, was a single outgoing wire transfer for $32,450. The destination account was partially masked for security, showing only the last 4 digits. But I recognized those specific numbers immediately. It was Declan's primary business checking account. The exact account he used to aggressively fund his lavish, fake millionaire lifestyle with his demanding new wife, Jasmine. But the absolute most horrifying part of the discovery was not just the destination of the stolen money. It was the digital timestamp sitting right next to the transaction line. The wire transfer had been initiated and fully cleared exactly 2 days ago. 2 days ago. My beautiful mother was still alive 2 days ago. She had been lying helpless in her rented hospice bed in the center of our living room, struggling painfully for every single shallow breath, her frail, bruised hand gripping mine weakly, while the liquid morphine slowly eased her out of this world. While I was sitting an exhausted vigil by her side, wiping her feverish forehead with a damp cloth and crying softly as I whispered that it was okay for her to finally let go, my older brother was actively logging into her secure financial accounts and draining every last cent she had to his own name. He did not come to the house to say a final goodbye. He did not pick up the phone to ask if she was in severe pain. He was entirely busy executing a cold, calculated, predatory wire transfer to strip away the very money that was meant to pay for the funeral we had just attended today. The sheer calculating evil of it hit me with the devastating force of a physical blow. The cold air inside the car suddenly felt entirely too thin to breathe. I had spent the last 5 years of my life drowning in heavy medical responsibilities. I gave up my 20s entirely. I stopped going out with friends. I canceled promising dates. I actively declined lucrative promotions at my medical billing firm because I desperately needed the flexibility to work from home, so I could be there the exact moment my mother needed her medications adjusted. I learned how to carefully flush complex intravenous lines. I learned how to constantly monitor dropping oxygen saturation levels. I learned how to physically lift a grown woman from a hospital bed to a wheelchair without hurting her fragile, failing bones. I sacrificed my youth, my career trajectory, and my own independent financial stability simply because I loved her with my entire heart. And Declan did absolutely nothing. He spent those exact same 5 years posting arrogant photos from luxury resorts in Miami, wearing custom-tailored suits, holding crystal glasses of expensive champagne, and boasting endlessly about his supposed real estate success to anyone who would listen. He married a woman who looked at our grieving family like nothing more than a profitable investment portfolio. Whenever I called him in tears, begging for his help, pleading with him to just come home for one single weekend so I could sleep for a full 8 hours without listening to a heart monitor alarm, he always had an elaborate excuse ready. He would tell me he was closing a massive commercial deal, or that his upscale networking events were absolutely crucial for his future wealth. He treated our mother's slow, agonizing terminal illness like a minor, irritating inconvenience that was distracting him from his glamorous life. And now, he had ruthlessly stolen the money that I had literally bled myself dry to save for her final care. The heavy grief that had been paralyzing my body all day suddenly evaporated into the cold air. In its exact place, a massive burning inferno of pure, unfiltered rage ignited deep in my chest. I did not care that I was sitting in a freezing car in a sketchy, poorly lit motel parking lot. I did not care that my clothes were soaked through and my only suitcase was ruined by the rain. I opened my text messages and aggressively pulled up Declan's contact profile. My thumbs flew across the digital keyboard, hitting the glass keys so hard, I genuinely thought the screen might shatter under the pressure. I typed furiously, letting 5 years of deeply suppressed anger, exhaustion, and bitter resentment pour directly into the message. I demanded to know how he could possibly do something so sickening. I typed out the harsh words with hot tears streaming down my face, completely blurring my vision in the dark car. I asked him how he could steal $32,000 from a dying woman's account while she was taking her final breaths. I reminded him of exactly what I had sacrificed for this family while he played pretend millionaire. I typed, "I gave up my entire 20s to change her IV bags and bathe her while you were busy taking networking vacations in Miami. You did not even bother to visit her when she was actively begging to see you one last time. That money was specifically saved for her outstanding medical bills and the funeral we just had today. You left me with absolutely nothing. I am currently sitting in a freezing car in a motel parking lot with no money to even pay for a cheap room tonight because of your theft." I hit the send button with a shaking finger. The small green bubble appeared on the glowing screen, confirming the message had successfully gone through. I sat there in the absolute dark, my chest heaving violently, the phone clutched desperately in both hands. I stared intensely at the screen, watching the 3 little gray dots appear at the bottom, indicating that he was actively typing a reply. My heart pounded furiously in my ears, drowning out the sound of the rain. I expected a cowardly lie. I expected him to claim it was an automated bank mistake, or to fabricate some convoluted legal excuse about avoiding estate taxes. I expected him to shift the blame entirely to his wife Jasmine, or to tell me the bank legally forced the transfer due to his power of attorney. I waited in the biting cold, holding my breath, anticipating the lengthy, manipulative explanation that would somehow attempt to justify the absolute destruction of my entire life. The 3 gray dots suddenly disappeared. A new message bubble popped up on my screen, glowing brightly in the dark car. I stared at his response, feeling the blood run completely cold in my veins. There were absolutely no words. There was no explanation. There was no defense. There was. Declan had simply replied with a single yellow laughing face emoji. The sun came up like a cruel joke. I had barely slept in my freezing car in that sketchy motel parking lot. Every muscle ached and my damp clothes clung to me, smelling of stale rain. But I could not afford to feel exhausted. I had a mission. I pulled into the local bank branch where my mother and I held our joint caregiving account for 5 years. I was going to freeze the account. I was going to report the wire transfer as a fraudulent transaction and demand that the bank instantly reverse the $32,000 before it fully cleared into his business account. I wiped my face with a crumpled fast food napkin, took a deep breath, and marched through the heavy glass doors the absolute second they unlocked. The warm air inside the bank lobby hit me, but it did nothing to thaw the ice in my chest. I headed straight for the teller line, my eyes focused and determined. But before I even reached the velvet ropes, a familiar, sickeningly arrogant laugh caught my attention. I froze in my tracks, turning my head toward the row of glass-walled offices. Sitting in a plush leather chair, across from a senior loan officer, was Declan. He was wearing a crisp, navy blue suit, his hair perfectly styled, sipping a complimentary cup of coffee, like he was the CEO of the world. He looked completely untroubled by the fact that he had buried his mother yesterday and thrown his sister out into a rainstorm. I walked closer, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Through the glass, I could see the thick stack of paperwork spread out across the desk. The title on the top folder was facing me, and the bold letters made my stomach drop all over again. Home Equity Line of Credit. He was not just stealing her cash, he was actively trying to take out a massive loan against our childhood house, the house I had spent 5 years maintaining. I pushed open the glass door to the office without knocking. Both Declan and the loan officer jumped. "What are you doing?" I demanded, my voice shaking with a terrifying mixture of rage and absolute disbelief. "You steal her entire life savings, and now you are trying to mortgage her house less than 24 hours after her funeral." Declan did not even have the decency to look ashamed. He set his coffee cup down on the desk, leaned back in his leather chair, and let out an exasperated sigh, looking at the loan officer as if I were a crazy person. "I need you to leave, Harper," he said smoothly. "I am conducting private business here." "Private business?" I shouted, entirely abandoning any sense of public decorum. You wiped out the joint medical account. That money was for her hospice care and her funeral expenses. You left me with absolutely nothing. My voice echoed loudly into the quiet bank lobby. Customers turned their heads. Tellers stopped counting cash. Declan stood up abruptly to try and intimidate me. He looked down his nose at my wrinkled, damp clothes. He raised his voice, intentionally making sure every single person in that lobby could hear him clearly. "I am securing the assets of my mother estate," he announced. "Someone has to be the responsible adult here. You have spent the last 5 years acting like a freeloader who lived entirely off mommy. You contributed absolutely nothing of value to this family. You hid in that house pretending to be a martyr, just so you did not have to get a real job." The sheer audacity of his lie was paralyzing. He was standing in a public space surrounded by strangers, painting me as a lazy parasite, while he actively orchestrated the theft of everything my mother owned. The branch manager, a woman named Susan, rushed into the office to intervene. She closed the glass door behind her, looking stressed. "Please, keep your voices down," Susan pleaded, holding up her hands. "Harper, I understand you are very upset, but you cannot scream in the lobby." I turned to her, desperate for an ally. "Susan, you know me," I pleaded, my voice cracking. "You know I managed that joint account. Declan wired $32,000 out of it 2 days ago. It is fraud. He stole it. You have to freeze the transfer and call the authorities right now." Susan looked away, a deep discomfort washing over her face. She walked over to the loan officer computer and tapped the keyboard a few times. She pulled up the specific file for our joint account. "I am so sorry," Harper, Susan said quietly, refusing to make direct eye contact with me. "I cannot reverse the transfer, and I cannot report it as fraud. The transaction was completely authorized." I stared at her, feeling the last remaining shreds of my hope disintegrate into dust. "Authorized," I repeated blindly. "How could it be authorized? I never approved that transfer." Susan pulled a scanned document up on her monitor and turned the screen slightly toward me. 2 years ago, your brother submitted a legally binding financial power of attorney. It gave him absolute control over all of Barbara assets, including the right to execute external wire transfers from any account with her name attached to it. The signature on the document belonged to my mother, but it looked shaky and weak. He had secretly coerced her into signing it years ago during one of his manipulative visits. Because of that piece of paper, the bank saw his theft as a perfectly legal administrative action. I stood in the middle of the bank office, surrounded by legal documents and cold reality. Declan smirked at me, his eyes gleaming with total victory. He had planned every single detail. I had nothing. No home, no money, and now no legal recourse. I was utterly defeated and financially ruined. I stumbled out of this bank and back into the freezing rain, feeling completely hollowed out. The heavy glass doors swung shut behind me, cutting off the sound of my brother's arrogant voice, but his words still echoed loudly in my ears. I climbed back into my freezing 12-year-old sedan, my hands shaking so violently I could barely fit the key into the ignition. I drove aimlessly for a few miles, completely blinded by tears and absolute panic. I had absolutely no money, no home, and no immediate plan for survival. I eventually pulled into the gravel parking lot of a rundown 24-hour diner on the edge of town. It was the kind of place that smelled permanently of stale grease and burnt coffee, but it was cheap and it was warm. I walked inside my wet clothes dripping onto the linoleum floor and slid into a cracked vinyl booth all the way in the back corner. I ordered a bottomless cup of black coffee using the very last 3 crumpled dollar bills I had in my damp purse. I sat there, wrapping my freezing hands around the thick ceramic mug, trying to figure out my next move. My mind raced through a dozen desperate scenarios. Could I sleep in my car? Could I beg a former coworker to let me crash on their couch? How was I going to afford food? I was so consumed by my own terrifying reality that I did not even hear the diner bell chime. I did not look up until a heavy gust of expensive floral perfume suddenly masked the smell of fried food. Someone slid smoothly into the booth directly across from me. I raised my heavy eyes and my breath caught in my throat. It was Jasmine. My sister-in-law sat there looking entirely out of place in the dingy diner. She was still wearing her flawless designer morning dress, her posture perfectly straight, her sleek hair untouched by the terrible weather outside. She placed her expensive leather handbag on the sticky table with a look of mild disgust. I stared at her completely bewildered. I asked her what she was doing here and how she had even found me. Jasmine did not answer my questions. She just looked at me with those sharp, calculating eyes, evaluating me the exact same way she would evaluate a distressed property she was about to flip for a massive profit. Her expression was completely devoid of any empathy. She reached into her designer bag, her manicured fingers pulling out a thick, crisp white envelope. She placed it on the table right next to my coffee mug and slowly pushed it across the scratched surface until it touched my hands. I looked down at the envelope and then back up at her. I asked her what it was. Jasmine folded her hands neatly on the table and leaned forward, her voice dropping into a low, chillingly calm register. She told me that was $500 in cash. She said it was enough to buy a one-way bus ticket to anywhere else and cover a couple of nights in a cheap motel while I found a minimum wage job. She wanted me to take it, and she wanted me to leave this state tonight. I sat completely frozen, gripping my coffee mug so tightly my knuckles turned white. I asked her if she was seriously trying to pay me to run away. Jasmine let out a soft, condescending sigh, like she was explaining a very simple concept to a very slow child. She claimed she was trying to help me, her tone dripping with fake pity. She said I was making this transition incredibly difficult for everyone. She reminded me that Declan was the executor of my mother estate, and he held all the cards now. She told me I had absolutely nothing tying me to this town anymore, because my mother was gone and left me with zero financial prospects. If I stayed here, she warned I was just going to embarrass myself further. I felt my jaw clench, my initial shock rapidly transforming into a hot, burning anger. I told her I was not going anywhere and that I fully intended to be present at my mother official will reading. I told her they could not just erase me from the family because it was convenient for their real estate plans. Jasmine actually chuckled a dry, humorless sound that sent a shiver straight down my spine. She called me remarkably naive, shaking her head. She insisted there was absolutely no reason for me to attend that will reading. She asked if I honestly thought Barbara left anything of value to the daughter who was essentially her live-in maid. Declan was the successful child she gloated. He was the one my mother trusted with her power of attorney, and he was the one she wanted to handle her legacy. Going to that lawyer office was only going to be a humiliating public reminder of exactly how little I actually meant to her. She told me to just take the cash, save myself, the humiliation, and walk away quietly before things got unnecessarily ugly for me. She stared at me, waiting for me to break. Waiting for me to eagerly snatch the envelope and accept my pathetic defeat. But as I sat there listening to her smooth, calculated monologue, something in my brain suddenly clicked. The pieces of the puzzle began shifting rapidly into place. Why was Jasmine, a highly successful and busy real estate agent, tracking me down in a greasy diner to offer me $500? Why were she and Declan so incredibly desperate for me to leave town right this exact second? If Declan truly held all the cards and the will reading was simply a formality, why did they care if I was sitting in the room? I looked at the envelope and then I looked deeply into Jasmine's eyes. I noticed a tiny flicker of nervous energy behind her confident facade. She was pushing too hard. She was rushing the timeline. I told her to keep her money. I told her I was not leaving, and I was certainly not skipping the will reading. Jasmine's posture stiffened, her fake smile instantly vanishing. Her eyes narrowed, and her voice lost its smooth corporate polish, turning sharp and aggressive. She snapped that I was making a massive mistake leaning across the table to intimidate me. She said I was severely underestimating how quickly they were moving forward. She mocked my belief that I could stick around and fight them for a few sentimental scraps, claiming I was already too late. Then, she practically spit the words at me, boasting that Declan already had the luxury contractors booked for the estate sale next week. The house would be completely cleared out and gutted before I even figured out how to hire a cheap lawyer. The second those arrogant words left her mouth, she stopped abruptly, her eyes widening just a fraction of an inch. She had talked too much. She had let her massive ego override her careful strategy. My mind raced, processing the incredible piece of information she had just accidentally handed me. An estate sale next week. That was completely impossible. I was not a lawyer, but even I knew the basic rules of probate. You absolutely cannot legally hire contractors to gut a house or schedule an estate sale to liquidate a deceased person's belongings before the will has even been officially read and entered into probate. A power of attorney completely expires the exact second the person dies. Declan had absolutely no legal authority to sell my mother things right now. They were moving way too fast, and they were deliberately bypassing the legal process. They were not just being cruel. They were hiding something massive. They were absolutely terrified of what was going to happen at that will reading, and they desperately needed me out of the picture before the truth was exposed. The heavy, crushing weight of my grief suddenly lifted, replaced by a sharp, laser-focused clarity. I did not feel like a helpless victim anymore. I felt a surge of pure adrenaline pumping through my veins. I slowly pushed the white envelope back across the sticky table until it was sitting directly in front of Jasmine. I told her I was not taking her money, my voice completely steady and dangerously calm. I told her she could tell my brother I would see him at the lawyer office. I stood up from the vinyl booth, leaving my untouched coffee on the table. I grabbed my damp purse and walked straight out of the diner without looking back, leaving her sitting there with her useless bribe and her sudden panicked realization that she had just made a critical mistake. I stepped back out into the cold rain, but this time I was not shivering. I was ready to fight. I sat in the damp driver's seat of my 12-year-old sedan, my heart hammering against my ribs with a fierce new rhythm. The freezing rain continued to batter the windshield, but I barely registered the cold anymore. Jasmine had just handed me the missing piece of the puzzle on a silver platter. An estate sale next week. Gutting the house. They were terrified and they were rushing. But knowing they were hiding something and actually proving it were two entirely different battles. I needed resources. I needed cash immediately just to survive the weekend. I reached into the back seat and pulled my bulky work laptop from its protective case. I plugged the car charger into the cigarette lighter, praying my dying car battery would hold out long enough for me to complete a few urgent medical billing invoices. If I could just submit a batch of clean claims tonight, my contracting agency might process an emergency direct deposit by Monday morning. I connected to the weak, unpredictable public Wi-Fi from the greasy diner I had just walked out of and opened my encrypted billing portal. The familiar blue and gray interface loaded slowly. For 5 years, this software had been my only tether to financial survival. I spent thousands of hours staring at these exact screens, typing complex alphanumeric medical codes while sitting at the kitchen table next to my mother hospital bed. I navigated to my local archive folder, searching for a specific batch of pending outpatient claims I had been working on before the funeral. My fingers moved mechanically across the cold keyboard, sorting the files by date. But as I scrolled through the dense list of patient identification numbers and procedural codes, my eyes caught on something completely out of place. It was a digital folder buried deep inside a subdirectory labeled November Routine Diagnostics. The creation date was exactly 6 months ago. The file name was odd. It read simply, Dr. Dictation BM Confidential. I frowned, staring at the screen. Medical dictation files were incredibly common in my line of work. Doctors recorded their patient notes and sent them to billers like me to translate into insurance codes. But the initials BM stood out instantly. Barbara, my mother. 6 months ago, her primary care physician had switched entirely to a secure cloud-based portal. We did not use standalone audio files anymore. Furthermore, my mother did not have any diagnostics done in November. She had been bedridden with a severe respiratory infection for that entire month. My pulse quickened. I moved the cursor over the file and double-clicked. A password prompt popped up, instantly blocking my access. The file was heavily encrypted. My hands began to shake again, but this time it was not from the cold. I stared at the blinking cursor on the password line. If this was just a standard medical file, it would use the agency default security key. I typed in the standard numeric sequence and hit enter. The screen flashed red. Access denied. I sat back in my seat, my mind racing through every possible combination. I tried my mother date of birth. Access denied. I tried the numerical street address of our childhood home. Access denied. I tried Declan birth date just in case. Access denied. A heavy wave of frustration washed over me. I rested my forehead against the steering wheel, closing my eyes and trying to channel my mother. She was a meticulous woman before the illness took her physical strength. She always used passwords that meant something deeply personal, but were impossible for outsiders to guess. I thought about her favorite things: her garden, her grandmother, maiden name the day she met my father. Then a very specific memory surfaced. The day I got my acceptance letter to my medical billing certification program. My mother had been so incredibly proud. She bought a cheap grocery store cake and wrote a specific phrase on it in sloppy blue icing. I opened my eyes, sat up straight, and carefully typed the phrase into the password box without any spaces. I typed, "Harper is my heart." I held my breath and pressed the enter key. The red warning box vanished. The screen blinked green and a high-resolution audio player popped up in the center of the monitor. I reached into my laptop bag, pulled out my cheap wired headphones, and plugged them into the audio jack. I pressed the small play button on the screen. There was a brief moment of static, a soft rustling sound like someone adjusting a microphone, and then a voice filled my ears. It was not a doctor. It was my mother. My breath caught sharply in my throat, and hot, sudden tears immediately flooded my eyes. Her voice was not the weak, raspy whisper I had grown so painfully accustomed to during her final weeks. This was recorded 6 months ago, before the heavy liquid morphine had completely clouded her vocal cords. Her voice was strong, clear, and incredibly steady. "Harper, my sweet girl." Her voice echoed through the headphones, wrapping around me like a warm blanket in the freezing car. If you are listening to this right now, it means I am gone, and it means you are likely feeling very lost and very alone. I am so deeply sorry to leave you, but I need you to listen to me very carefully. You must not cry right now. You need to be strong, because I have left you a battle to fight, and you are the only one who can finish it. I pressed my hands over my mouth, trying to stifle a loud sob. Just hearing her speak with such absolute clarity was completely overwhelming. My mother took a slow, deliberate breath on the recording. "I know exactly what your brother is doing," she said, her tone shifting from warm and maternal to something incredibly sharp and fiercely protective. "I know Declan has been siphoning money from my accounts. I know he has been abusing the power of attorney. I foolishly signed years ago when I still believed he was a decent man. I know he thinks I am just a senile, dying old woman who does not understand banking notifications. I know about the expensive luxury cars he cannot afford. And I know all about Jasmine." She paused, and I could hear the bitter disappointment heavy in her words. "I know that ambitious real estate agent he married has been measuring my living room walls while I was trying to sleep. I heard them whispering in the hallway during Thanksgiving. I heard Jasmine telling Declan they needed to aggressively push me into a state-run nursing facility so they could stage my house and flip it for a massive commission before the market cooled down. They think I am deaf and blind, Harper. They think because my body is failing, my mind is gone too. They are entirely wrong." My jaw dropped. I stared at the glowing laptop screen, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of her words. She knew. She had known everything all along. She continued speaking, her voice gaining an undeniable edge of authority. 3 years ago, when I first realized exactly who your brother had become, I made a choice. I knew if I confronted him directly, he would simply find a way to manipulate the situation, or worse, he would try to force me into a legal conservatorship to seize total control. I knew you were too kind and too fiercely loyal to believe your own brother was capable of such profound evil. So I let them both believe they were outsmarting me. I deliberately left that joint caregiving account open and vulnerable. I let Declan take the cash. I let him leave a massive, undeniable digital paper trail of his federal wire fraud. I let him build a fake luxury lifestyle on stolen money because a thief always gets greedy, and greed makes people incredibly careless. I wiped my tear-stained cheeks, leaning closer to the screen as if she were sitting right there in the passenger seat beside me. I have spent the last 3 years working with a private estate attorney to completely secure your future, Harper, she said. Declan thinks he holds the keys to the castle. He has absolutely nothing. I have legally shielded the house, the investment portfolios, and every single family heirloom, but the real documentation is not hidden in the house. Declan and Jasmine would have destroyed it the second my heart stopped beating. I listened intently, memorizing every single syllable she spoke. I need you to drive to the neighboring town of Oakridge, she instructed clearly. There is a small independent branch of the First National Bank on Elm Street. I have rented a private secure safety deposit box under your maiden name. The box number is 412. The combination to open the vault requires 2 specific numbers. The first is my exact birth year, and the second is the exact time you were born down to the minute. I know you know these numbers by heart. Inside that metal box, you will find a physical key, a portable encrypted hard drive, and a sealed envelope containing the direct contact information for my private attorney. His name is Sterling Davis. He is expecting your call. You take those documents directly to him. You do not speak a single word to your brother. You do not warn Jasmine. You let them walk right into the trap I have meticulously built for them. The recording went silent for a few seconds. When my mother spoke again, her voice cracked slightly thick with a profound, overwhelming love that transcended death itself. I am so incredibly proud of the woman you have become, Harper. You gave up so much to take care of me. You have a beautiful, selfless heart. But now it is time for you to have a spine of absolute steel. Go get your house back, my sweet girl. Make them pay for every single tear they made you shed. I love you. The audio file clicked and ended abruptly, leaving me sitting in the absolute silence of my cold, dark car. I pulled the headphones out of my ears, my hands no longer shaking. The paralyzing grief, the suffocating panic, the terrifying fear of homelessness, they were all completely gone. In their place was a cold, brilliant, burning sense of purpose. My mother had not left me defenseless. She had handed me a loaded weapon. I looked at the digital clock on my dashboard. It was nearly midnight. The bank in Oakridge would not open until 9 in the morning. I closed my laptop, safely packing it away. I turned the key in the ignition, listening to the old engine roar to life. I put the car in drive and pulled out of the dirty motel parking lot, heading straight for the highway. I was going to sleep in the bank parking lot tonight. I was going to be the very first person through their doors tomorrow. Declan and Jasmine thought they had successfully evicted a naive, helpless victim. They were about to find out they had simply unleashed the absolute wrath of a mother who loved her daughter enough to orchestrate the perfect revenge from the grave. I drove straight through the freezing rain, gripping the steering wheel so hard my hands cramped into painful, tight fists. The 2-hour drive to Oakridge felt like an agonizing eternity, suspended in absolute darkness. My car heater was still completely broken, blowing only a pathetic stream of lukewarm air against my soaking wet morning dress, but the pure adrenaline rushing through my veins kept the violent shivering at bay. My mother's strong, steady voice kept playing on an endless loop in my mind. Go get your house back, my sweet girl. I repeated those exact words out loud to the empty car, using them as a desperate anchor to keep myself from completely falling apart. By the time I finally crossed the city limits into the quiet, upscale suburb of Oakridge, the sun was just beginning to drag itself over the horizon, painting the heavy gray storm clouds a bruised, bloody purple. I found the First National Bank right on Elm Street, exactly where the hidden audio file said it would be. It was a small, independent brick building that looked completely unassuming. I parked my battered 12-year-old sedan in the empty lot and sat there for 2 agonizing hours watching the digital clock on my dashboard slowly tick toward 9 in the morning. I thought about Declan dragging my suitcase across the porch. I thought about Jasmine holding her fancy tablet, looking at my childhood home like it was nothing more than a quick commission check. They had absolutely no idea what was coming. When the bank manager finally walked to the front glass doors and turned the open sign around, I was already standing on the wet pavement waiting for him. I walked inside my wet shoes, squeaking loudly against the pristine marble floor. A middle-aged teller looked up from her station, her eyes briefly scanning my damp, wrinkled black dress and my exhausted, pale face. I did not care how completely unhinged I looked. I walked straight up to her polished counter, squared my shoulders, and stated my maiden name with absolute, unwavering clarity. I told her I needed immediate access to private safety deposit box 412. The teller paused, pulling up a highly secure file on her computer monitor. She asked for my physical identification. I handed over my driver license, praying silently that my mother had set this up perfectly before her health declined. The teller scrutinized my identification card, typed a long string of access codes into her system, and gave me a warm, professional nod. She summoned the branch manager, a tall man with silver hair, who escorted me silently past the row of teller stations and into the heavy, reinforced steel vault located in the very back of the building. The air inside the vault was incredibly cold and smelled distinctively of polished metal and old paper. The manager pointed to a medium-sized rectangular metal box set waist-high in the thick steel wall. He handed me a heavy brass master key, explaining that the secondary security lock required a personalized numeric combination. He stepped outside, pulling the heavy metal privacy door firmly shut behind him. I stood completely alone in the silent vault. My hands were trembling violently as I reached out and touched the freezing steel of the combination dial. I took a deep, shuddering breath and carefully dialed the specific numbers my mother had given me on that hidden audio recording. First, I entered her exact birth year. Second, I entered the exact minute of my birth. The heavy internal mechanism clicked loudly into place, echoing sharply in the small room. I turned the brass master key and pulled the heavy metal drawer straight out of the wall. I carried the metal box into a small private viewing room just outside the main vault. I locked the thick wooden door behind me, sat down at the polished mahogany table, and slowly lifted the metal lid. Inside the dark velvet-lined box sat 3 very specific items. There was a sleek silver storage drive, an incredibly thick, heavy stack of official legal documents, bound with a thick rubber band, and a single ivory envelope with my name written across the front, in my flawless, elegant cursive handwriting. I picked up the ivory envelope first. My hands shook so aggressively I could barely break the thick red wax seal. I pulled out the crisp, heavy parchment paper and began to read the final words my mother had left for me in this physical world. My dearest Harper. The letter began. If you are sitting in this room holding this paper, it means my absolute worst fears about your brother have been completely confirmed. It means Declan showed his true greedy colors the exact moment he believed I was no longer a threat. I am so deeply sorry that you had to endure whatever cruelty he and Jasmine inflicted on you to get you to this point. But I promise you, my sweet girl, his arrogant reign ends right now. I read the next detailed paragraph, feeling my pulse hammer wildly against my eardrums. My mother explained that 3 years ago, right after she received her terminal medical diagnosis, she started noticing massive, alarming discrepancies in her primary business accounts. Declan had been quietly siphoning off thousands of dollars to aggressively fund his fake millionaire lifestyle with Jasmine. He thought he was incredibly clever, masking the stolen transactions as legitimate real estate business expenses. But Barbara was not just a grieving, fragile widow. She was a brilliant, meticulous woman who understood complex corporate finance better than anyone in our entire family. She knew instantly that confronting Declan directly would be absolutely useless. He would just lie, manipulate the truth, and possibly force her into a restrictive legal conservatorship to seize total control over her remaining assets. So she decided to play a brilliant long game. She told me exactly what she had done in the next few sentences, and the sheer absolute brilliance of it made me gasp out loud in the quiet viewing room. 3 years ago, my mother secretly met with a high-powered private estate attorney who specialized in wealthy clients. She quietly and legally completely revoked the broad financial power of attorney she had previously given to Declan. He had absolutely no idea the important legal document he currently possessed and paraded around the bank was entirely legally void. But she did not stop there. My mother took things a massive step further. She legally transferred the title of our childhood home, her $2 million investment portfolio, and every single valuable family heirloom into an ironclad, impenetrable, irrevocable blind trust. Because the trust was irrevocable, it meant the massive assets were completely shielded from the standard probate process. They were entirely immune to any outside familial claims and absolutely untouchable by any aggressive divorce attorneys or greedy relatives looking for a quick payout. Declan and Jasmine thought they were going to inherit a massive suburban real estate empire. They had absolutely no idea that the entire empire had already been quietly moved entirely out of their greedy reach. I set the parchment letter down on the mahogany table and eagerly picked up the thick stack of legal documents. Right there on the very first page, printed in bold, undeniable black ink, was the official registered name of the Irrevocable Blind Trust. Directly beneath it was the massive, shocking twist that instantly changed the entire trajectory of my life forever. The legal document explicitly stated that upon my mother passing, the sole uncontested beneficiary and the singular legal executor of the entire multi-million-dollar trust was me, Harper. I owned the house. I owned the massive investment portfolio. I owned every single thing Declan and Jasmine were currently measuring for their luxury renovations. I was not homeless. I was not a broke, discarded burden taking up space in their property. I was a multimillionaire, and I legally held the absolute deed to the very roof my brother was currently standing under. But the absolute most satisfying, terrifyingly brilliant part of my mother master plan was detailed in the final paragraph of her letter. I picked the parchment back up my hands, gripping the edges so tightly the paper crinkled. Harper, she wrote, you are probably wondering why I let your brother drain that joint caregiving account 2 days ago. I let him do it because I purposefully left that specific account open and fully funded as a deliberate decoy. I knew his incredible greed would absolutely consume him when he realized my time was rapidly running out. That specific bank account was legally disconnected from his revoked power of attorney exactly 3 years ago. By logging in and initiating an unauthorized $32,000 wire transfer across state lines using a legally void document, your brother did not just commit petty familial theft. He committed a massive, undeniable act of federal wire fraud. I left the money sitting there as irresistible bait, and he walked right into the trap. That silver storage drive sitting in the box contains every single piece of forensic accounting evidence, every forged signature, and every illegal transfer Declan has made over the last 3 years. I gave you the absolute power to completely destroy his life. I read those final words over and over again, letting the sheer magnitude of my new reality wash over me. I carefully packed the legal documents, the digital drive, and the letter into my damp purse. I stood up from the mahogany table, feeling a profound sense of absolute power radiating through my entire body. I was no longer the exhausted, grieving victim begging for a place to stay. I was the executioner, and I was ready to meet the attorney who helped my mother build this beautiful trap. I drove straight from the bank vault in Oak Ridge to the towering glass and steel high-rise in the center of the city. The rain had finally stopped, but the heavy gray clouds still hung low over the skyline, matching the intense, heavy gravity that had been crushing my chest since the funeral. I parked my battered 12-year-old sedan between a row of gleaming, imported sports cars in the underground parking garage. I was wearing the exact same clothes I had worn to my mother's funeral yesterday. My black dress was still damp at the hems, and my hair was pulled back into a messy knot, but I absolutely did not care. I walked into the grand marble lobby of the luxury law firm, feeling like a completely different woman than the shattered, grieving daughter who had been violently thrown out into the freezing rain just 12 hours ago. I approached the polished mahogany reception desk and told the receptionist I had an emergency meeting with Sterling Davis. She looked at my wrinkled clothes with a brief flash of mild judgment, but the exact moment I spoke my mother's name, her entire demeanor shifted to absolute professional deference. She immediately escorted me up to the top floor and led me into a massive corner office that overlooked the entire sprawling city. Sterling Davis was not a warm, comforting family lawyer. He was a shark. He wore an impeccably tailored charcoal suit and possessed the sharp, calculating eyes of a man who had spent his entire career destroying entitled, greedy people in courtrooms. He stood up from behind his massive glass desk the moment I walked in. He extended a firm hand and offered his condolences with a brief, respectful nod, but he did not offer any empty platitudes or fake sympathy. He looked at me directly and told me that Barbara was one of the most brilliant and formidable clients he had ever had the absolute pleasure of representing. He said she had anticipated this exact day for 3 long years, and she had hired him specifically to ensure that her final wishes were executed with absolute merciless precision. I sat down in the heavy leather guest chair across from him and pulled the damp contents of the safety deposit box from my purse. I placed the thick stack of legal documents, the silver storage drive, and the ivory envelope directly onto his pristine glass desk. Sterling picked up the documents and began to review them with lightning speed. He traced his pen over the signatures and confirmed that the irrevocable blind trust my mother had created was entirely bulletproof. He explained in a calm, methodical voice that my mother had legally transferred the deed to the house, the $2 million investment portfolio, and every single tangible asset into this trust exactly 3 years ago. He told me that Declan had absolutely no legal standing to evict me to sell the house or to inherit a single dime of the estate. But then I reached into my purse and pulled out the printed screenshots of my banking app. My hands shook slightly as I handed him the digital ledger showing the absolute zero balance in the joint caregiving account. I told him that I needed to know exactly what to do about the $32,000 Declan had stolen while our mother was taking her final breaths. I told him that Declan was currently sitting in a local bank branch, actively trying to secure a massive home equity line of credit against the house using his old power of attorney. I told him how Jasmine was already holding an iPad in my living room, booking luxury contractors to completely gut the property by next Monday morning. Sterling stopped reading. He set the papers down and looked at me with an expression of intense, focused, predatory calculation. He asked me to confirm the exact date and time of the outgoing wire transfer. I pointed to the timestamp on the printout. I told him the transfer was initiated and cleared 2 days ago while my mother was still actively dying in her hospice bed. Sterling leaned back in his leather chair and a slow, chillingly satisfied smile spread across his face. He laced his fingers together and looked me dead in the eye. He told me that what my brother had just done was the absolute worst possible mistake he could have ever made in his entire life. He explained that when my mother secretly revoked Declan power of attorney 3 years ago, she made sure it was officially filed and legally recorded with the state. Declan was completely legally stripped of all his financial authority over her assets from that exact moment forward. Sterling leaned forward, resting his forearms on the glass desk. His voice dropped into a low, deadly, serious tone that commanded the entire room. He explained that by logging into a secure financial institution and using a legally void revoked document to initiate a massive electronic transfer of $32,000 to an external business account, Declan did not just commit simple family theft. He committed a major federal crime. Because the money was moved electronically, using fraudulent credentials, it automatically triggered severe federal statutes. "This is no longer a simple civil family dispute, Harper." He said, his words cutting through the airs like a blade. "This is federal wire fraud. Your brother has just handed us the exact rope we need to hang him." The sheer weight of his words hit me with breathtaking force. Federal wire fraud. Declan was not just a greedy, entitled brother who had taken advantage of our dying mother. He was a criminal who had carelessly and aggressively documented his own felony, all because he thought he was completely untouchable. I asked Sterling what our immediate next steps should be. I asked if I should call the police right now or go back to the local bank and demand they freeze his business accounts. I wanted to march right back to that lobby and wipe the smug, arrogant smile off Declan's face. I wanted to look Jasmine in the eye and tell her that her precious real estate empire was actually an active federal crime scene. I wanted them to feel the exact same sheer terror and panic that I felt when they locked me out in the freezing rain. But Sterling held up his hand, stopping my racing, vengeful thoughts. He advised me to do absolutely nothing. He told me to stay completely silent and entirely out of sight. He explained that the most dangerous thing we could possibly do right now was spook them before the trap was fully set. If we confronted Declan today, he might panic and attempt to hide the stolen funds offshore or aggressively destroy the digital paper trail before we could officially subpoena his business records. We needed him to feel completely safe, completely victorious, and completely arrogant. Sterling laid out the master strategy with cold, methodical precision. He instructed me to let Declan keep the $32,000 for now. He told me to let Jasmine continue calling her luxury contractors and planning her expensive kitchen renovations. He even told me to let Declan continue filing the fraudulent paperwork for the home equity line of credit, knowing the bank would ultimately flag the property title mismatch once it hit the formal underwriting department. We want them to dig the hole as deep as humanly possible, Sterling said calmly. Every single fraudulent signature Declan puts on a new bank document is another solid nail in his coffin. He explained that the official will reading was scheduled for next Friday, exactly 8 days from now. He instructed me to ignore their taunting text messages, to stay quietly in my cheap motel room, and to play the part of the defeated, broken sister. They need to believe they have won completely, he insisted. They need to walk into my conference room next week, bursting with false confidence and unchecked greed. When they are absolutely certain they have conquered you, the fall will completely shatter them. I listened to this high-powered attorney map out the absolute destruction of the brother who had thrown me out into the rain. A profound, deep sense of calm began to wash over my exhausted body. For 5 long years, I had been the silent, reliable caretaker. I had absorbed their insults, their financial abuse, and their endless disrespect because I thought it was the only possible way to keep the peace for my dying mother. But my mother was gone, and she had used her final brilliant acts on this earth to hand me the ultimate weapon of justice. She had protected me when I could not protect myself. I looked at Sterling Davis, and I slowly nodded my head. I agreed to the plan. I would sit in the shadows for 1 more week. I would let Jasmine post her arrogant photos on social media, acting like the queen of a castle she did not own. I would let Declan spend money that belonged to a federal investigation. I gathered the empty folders and placed them back into my damp purse. When I stood up to leave Sterling office, my legs were no longer shaking. My tears were completely dry. I thanked him for his time and walked out into the busy city streets, ready to embrace the silence, knowing that the loudest and most devastating word would be spoken in exactly 8 days. I walked out of Sterling Davis' office and stepped back into the damp Seattle air, feeling completely transformed. I drove my battered 12-year-old sedan straight back to the cheap roadside motel and paid for exactly 8 more nights in cash. The small room smelled heavily of industrial bleach and stale cigarette smoke, but to me it felt like an absolute fortress. I locked the flimsy wooden door, pulled the heavy blackout curtains tightly shut, and went into complete, absolute stealth mode. Sterling had given me one strict directive, and I was going to follow it with ruthless precision. I had to become an absolute ghost. I placed my phone on the cheap laminate nightstand and watched the screen light up almost immediately. Declan was relentlessly sending me taunting text messages. He was completely drunk on his own perceived power. He texted me to say the locks on the house had already been officially changed. He texted to brag that the estate sale liquidators were coming on Wednesday to evaluate all of our mother vintage furniture. He even had the absolute audacity to send a message demanding I pay him back for the garbage bags he used to throw my belongings onto the porch. The old Harper, the exhausted, broken sister who had spent 5 years desperately trying to keep the peace, would have immediately texted back. I would have begged him to at least let me keep the silver-framed photograph of our mother. I would have pleaded with him to stop erasing her entire life before her ashes were even settled in the ground. But I did not type a single word. I simply watched the cruel messages pop up on my screen one by one, feeling absolutely no pain at all. Every single taunting text he sent was just another shovel full of dirt he was throwing onto his own grave. I silenced my phone and opened my laptop. While Declan was aggressively texting me, his wife was busy broadcasting their massive financial crimes to the entire world. I created a fake anonymous social media account just to quietly monitor Jasmine's digital footprint. She was completely unhinged. She had absolutely no idea that she was publicly documenting a federal fraud case in real time. Her Instagram stories were a continuous, sickening montage of unchecked greed and absolute entitlement. On Tuesday morning, she posted a video of herself holding a glass of expensive champagne in our mother kitchen, loudly complaining about how the outdated oak cabinets were completely ruining her aesthetic. She filmed the luxury contractors walking through the hallway, pointing out exactly which load-bearing walls they were going to demolish next week. But the absolute climax of her arrogant delusion happened on Thursday afternoon. Jasmine posted a highly produced professional-looking video of herself standing outside an exclusive high-end luxury car dealership downtown. She was wearing a pristine white designer suit and holding a giant, obnoxious red velvet bow. The camera panned over to reveal a brand new, fully loaded black Porsche SUV gleaming under the showroom lights. The caption she typed underneath the video literally made my jaw drop. It read, "Celebrating our massive new real estate empire." Hard work absolutely pays off when you surround yourself with a winner, like my amazing husband, Declan. Cheers to our multi-million-dollar future. She was actively flexing a luxury vehicle, completely oblivious to the fact that her husband had literally stolen the down payment from a dying woman hospice account just days earlier. I watched the video loop 3 times, staring at her smug, victorious smile. She truly believed she had won. She believed she had successfully evicted the pathetic freeloader sister and secured a massive suburban fortune. She was confidently signing predatory loan agreements and high-interest auto financing contracts based entirely on a legally void power of attorney and a completely revoked inheritance. I sat alone in the dim, harsh lighting of my cheap motel room, surrounded by the humming noise of the highway outside. I ate instant ramen, quietly savoring the cheap, salty broth, while I watched them aggressively destroy their own lives on my glowing computer screen. I did not feel an ounce of pity for either of them. They had treated my mother like a burdensome obstacle, and me like disposable trash. Now they were walking blindly into a devastating financial trap, and I was going to let them take every single step completely undisturbed. For the next 7 days, I simply put my head down and worked. I logged into my medical billing portal every single morning at 6 and processed complex insurance claims until my eyes burned. I needed to maintain my own independent income. I refused to touch a single dime of the massive trust my mother had left me until Sterling formally cleared the estate through probate. I worked relentlessly in the quiet shadows, typing numeric medical codes, while Declan and Jasmine lived completely out loud on stolen, borrowed time. I watched my bank account grow from my honest hard work while they racked up hundreds of thousands of dollars in fraudulent luxury debt. The contrast between my quiet, isolated reality and their loud, arrogant fantasy was incredibly stark. But I knew the absolute truth. I knew exactly what was waiting for them inside that sealed ivory envelope. I counted down the exact minutes until Friday afternoon. I meticulously prepared the outfit I was going to wear, making sure every detail was absolutely perfect. I was completely ready to walk into Sterling Davis' high-powered downtown law office and unleash the absolute storm they had brought upon themselves. I was going to sit at that polished mahogany conference table, look my brother dead in his eyes, and watch his entire fake multi-million-dollar universe instantly collapse into dust. They had told me to get out of my own home, and now I was going to make absolutely sure they never had a home to return to. Friday morning arrived with a blindingly bright sun that felt entirely out of place for the occasion. The heavy gray storm clouds that had been suffocating the city for the past week had completely vanished, leaving behind a crisp, cold, and unforgivingly clear sky. I stood in front of the scratched mirror in the cramped bathroom of my cheap motel room, carefully adjusting the collar of my clothes. I was wearing a simple navy blue blazer that I had purchased from a local thrift store 3 years ago. It was slightly frayed at the cuffs, and the fabric was stiff, but it was the most professional piece of clothing I currently owned. I smoothed down the lapels, taking a deep, steady breath. The old Harper, the exhausted and beaten-down caregiver who had spent 5 agonizing years changing intravenous bags and swallowing endless insults, would have looked in this mirror and felt completely inadequate. She would have felt small and pathetic compared to the wealthy, aggressive people she was about to face. But the woman looking back at me in the mirror today was not that person anymore. I felt an incredible, terrifying sense of calm settling deep into my bones. I picked up my damp purse, feeling the heavy, solid weight of the secret documents resting securely inside. The undeniable proof of my mother-brilliant trap and my brother impending federal destruction was sitting right there in my bag. I walked out of the motel room, leaving the stale smell of industrial bleach behind, and got into my battered 12-year-old sedan. The drive into the downtown financial district was a blur of morning traffic and towering steel skyscrapers. I navigated the busy streets with a strange, hyper-focused clarity. I pulled into the underground parking garage beneath the massive glass building that housed Sterling Davis Elite Law Firm. I parked my old sedan between 2 gleaming, imported luxury vehicles, feeling absolutely no shame about the stark contrast. I turned off the ignition and just sat there in the silence of the concrete garage for a long moment. I visualized my mother. I pictured her sharp, knowing eyes and her fierce, protective spirit. I remembered the exact tone of her recorded voice telling me to have a spine of absolute steel. I whispered a quiet thank you to the empty car, grabbed my purse, and walked toward the polished brass elevators. I rode up to the 47th floor, watching the digital numbers climb higher and higher, taking me further away from the desperate, vulnerable girl who had been crying in a freezing parking lot just days ago. When the elevator doors finally slid silently open, I stepped out into the grand, immaculate reception area of the law firm. The waiting room was a masterclass in psychological intimidation. It was designed to make you feel incredibly small. The floors were cut from flawless imported marble. The walls were paneled in rich dark mahogany, and the furniture consisted of heavy, genuine leather armchairs that looked like they cost more than my entire car. A massive abstract painting hung behind the reception desk, where a severe-looking woman in a tailored black suit was typing quietly on a computer. The entire space smelled of expensive leather, freshly printed paper, and quiet, unchecked power. I walked up to the desk and clearly stated my name. The receptionist looked up, her eyes briefly darting over my thrift store blazer and my simple, worn shoes. She gave me a tight, polite, professional nod and directed me to take a seat in one of the leather armchairs near the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. I sat down, placing my purse carefully on my lap. I looked out over the sprawling city skyline, watching the tiny cars moving like ants on the streets far below. The silence in the waiting room was absolute and heavy. I was 30 minutes early. I wanted to be there first. I wanted to be firmly planted in my seat when the vultures finally arrived to pick over the bones of our mother estate. Exactly 20 minutes later, the polished brass elevator chimed loudly, breaking the heavy silence of the room. The heavy doors slid open, and Declan and Jasmine stepped out onto the marble floor. They did not just enter the room, they completely invaded it. They brought a wave of loud, obnoxious energy that instantly shattered the quiet, professional atmosphere. Declan was wearing a custom-tailored charcoal gray suit that hugged his shoulders perfectly. His hair was slicked back, and he was wearing a heavy gold watch that caught the sunlight pouring through the windows. He looked like a man walking into a victory parade. But Jasmine was the true spectacle. She was treating this solemn, legal waiting room exactly like a VIP lounge at an exclusive nightclub. She strutted off the elevator wearing a glaringly loud designer outfit that screamed new money. She had on a pristine white silk blouse, an oversized designer belt with a massive gold logo, and a pair of red-bottomed heels that clicked aggressively against the marble floor. She was holding a large iced coffee in one hand and her expensive leather handbag in the other. Her designer sunglasses were pushed up onto the top of her perfectly styled hair. Jasmine immediately marched right up to the reception desk, completely ignoring the basic rules of common courtesy. She leaned heavily against the mahogany counter and loudly announced their arrival, speaking to the receptionist as if the woman were a personal servant. "We are the Myers family," she declared, her voice echoing sharply off the glass walls. "We are here for the estate reading with Sterling Davis. You can go ahead and let him know that Declan and Jasmine have arrived, and we are on a very tight schedule today. We have contractors meeting us at the new property in 2 hours, so we really need to get this legal paperwork wrapped up quickly." The receptionist blinked, clearly taken aback by the sheer audacity and overwhelming volume of the woman standing in front of her. The receptionist politely informed Jasmine that Mr. Davis was finishing up another matter and would call us into the conference room shortly. Jasmine let out a loud, theatrical sigh, rolling her eyes and turning dramatically on her expensive heels. She muttered something under her breath about how incredibly slow lawyers always were when they were billing by the hour. Declan chuckled, wrapping his arm proudly around his wife's waist and kissing the side of her head. They were completely drunk on their own perceived victory. They honestly believed they were literally minutes away from inheriting a multi-million-dollar fortune. It was in that exact moment of arrogant celebration that Jasmine finally turned her head and noticed me sitting quietly in the corner by the windows. Her triumphant smile instantly froze on her face. She stopped walking and narrowed her eyes, staring at me like I was a foul, disgusting insect that had somehow crawled past the building security guards. She tapped Declan on the shoulder and pointed a manicured finger in my direction. Declan turned his head, and his entire posture immediately stiffened. The smug, relaxed energy drained out of him, replaced by a sudden flash of profound irritation. He let out a harsh, bitter laugh and shook his head, stepping away from Jasmine and walking directly toward my chair. Jasmine followed closely right behind him, her red heels clicking like a metronome counting down to a confrontation. They stopped less than 3 feet in front of me, looming over my seated figure. They were attempting to use their expensive clothes and their aggressive physical presence to intimidate me, to make me feel small and utterly worthless. "Well, look who decided to show up," Jasmine sneered, crossing her arms tightly over her silk blouse. She looked me up and down, her eyes blatantly mocking my appearance. She stared directly at my frayed sleeves and the cheap fabric of my navy blazer. Her lips curled into a cruel, vicious little smirk. "I am actually incredibly surprised to see you here, Harper. I honestly thought you would have taken my very generous cash offer at the diner and hopped on a Greyhound bus out of town by now. But I guess some people just absolutely love to subject themselves to public humiliation." She looked at Declan and let out a sharp, cruel giggle. I mean, seriously, look at her, Declan. She is sitting in a high-end corporate law firm, wearing a jacket that literally looks like she pulled it out of a charity donation bin. It is honestly just pathetic at this point. She should have just stayed at whatever cheap, dirty motel she has been hiding in all week. She is just wasting everyone valuable time. Declan did not laugh. He was staring at me with a dark, heavy intensity. His eyes were cold and completely devoid of any brotherly affection. He saw me as nothing more than a minor, frustrating obstacle that he needed to aggressively swat away so he could get back to his fraudulent real estate empire. He took another step forward, closing the physical distance between us until he was standing directly over me. He leaned down, his face coming dangerously close to mine. I could smell the strong, expensive cologne he was wearing. It smelled exactly like the artificial arrogance he wrapped himself in every single day. He lowered his voice so the receptionist across the room could not hear him, but the venom in his words was unmistakable. He was trying to deliver a chilling final blow to my spirit before the lawyer walked out. "I do not know what kind of delusional, pathetic fantasy you are currently playing out in your head right now, Harper." He whispered, his voice dripping with pure, unfiltered malice. "But I am going to tell you exactly how this next hour is going to go. We are going to walk into that conference room. The lawyer is going to officially read the documents that formally acknowledge I am the sole person in charge of this entire estate, just like Mother wanted. You are going to sit there quietly and listen to him confirm that you get absolutely nothing. And the absolute second this reading is completely over, the second that lawyer closes his folder, I am going to personally wave over the building security guards. I am going to have them physically grab you by the arms and forcefully escort you out of this building and throw you back out onto the street where you belong. You are completely finished here, Harper. You are a nobody. You have no money. You have no house, and you have absolutely no family left. You are completely and utterly, entirely alone." He stayed, leaned over me, waiting for the reaction he so desperately craved. He wanted to see my eyes fill with hot, terrified tears. He wanted to see my lower lip tremble. He wanted me to shrink back into the leather chair and apologize for breathing his air. He wanted the complete and total submission of the sister he had bullied and dismissed for his entire adult life. But I did not cry. I did not shrink. I did not look away. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting calmly on the purse that held the absolute destruction of his entire pathetic existence. I thought about the $32,000 he had stolen. I thought about the federal wire fraud charges, waiting to completely decimate his fake empire. I thought about the irrevocable blind trust that legally made me the undisputed owner of everything he thought he possessed. I looked directly into his dark, angry eyes, and I did the one thing he absolutely never expected. I smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was not a nervous smile. It was an incredibly slow, cold, and utterly chilling smile that reached all the way to my eyes. It was the smile of an executioner looking at a man who had cheerfully built his own gallows. Declan's face faltered. The absolute, unshakable confidence in his eyes cracked just a tiny fraction of an inch. He blinked, staring at my stoic, peaceful expression, completely unnerved by my absolute lack of fear. He opened his mouth to say something else to try and regain control of the psychological high ground he felt slipping away. But before he could utter another toxic word, the heavy double mahogany doors at the end of the waiting room suddenly unlatched and swung wide open. A tall, imposing junior associate stepped out into the lobby, holding a thick leather-bound file. The associate looked directly at our tense, silent trio and spoke with loud, clear, professional authority. "Mr. Davis is ready for you now. Please step inside the conference room. The reading of the estate is about to begin." The heavy mahogany doors of the conference room clicked shut behind us, sealing us inside with absolute finality. The room was massive and intimidating, dominated by a long, polished glass table surrounded by high-backed black leather chairs. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the gray city skyline, but my attention was entirely focused on the man sitting at the head of the table. Sterling Davis sat there, looking like a lethal predator, waiting patiently in the tall grass. He had a thick manila folder resting squarely in front of him. Declan and Jasmine immediately claimed the two chairs closest to Sterling, positioning themselves as the rightful heirs to a kingdom they had already conquered in their own minds. I took a seat near the far end of the table, deliberately placing myself on the margins exactly where they expected me to be. I kept my face entirely blank, letting my posture slump just a fraction of an inch to completely sell the illusion of a defeated, broken woman. Sterling cleared his throat and opened the folder with deliberate, calculated slowness. He did not look at me. He looked directly at Declan, adjusting his expensive reading glasses. He announced that we were gathered here to formally review the final wishes and estate distribution of Barbara. He began reading the preliminary clauses in a smooth, monotonous voice that completely masked the absolute destruction he was about to unleash. But Sterling was a master of his craft. He knew exactly how to bait a hook. Instead of instantly revealing the new documents, he purposefully started by reading the preamble of an older, outdated will from over 7 years ago. He read a specific paragraph where my mother had once referred to Declan as her trusted eldest son and the designated protector of the family assets. I watched my brother physically react to those specific words. Declan visibly swelled, puffing out his chest and leaning back into his expensive leather chair with a sickeningly triumphant sigh. He shot a quick, victorious glance in my direction, a silent, arrogant confirmation that he had won and I had lost everything. Jasmine reached under the table and placed her manicured hand on his knee, nodding along to Sterling words with a completely fabricated expression of solemn grief. They were absolutely vibrating with unchecked greed. They were so incredibly eager to get their hands on my mother, lifetime of hard work, that they were not even paying attention to the actual legal terminology Sterling was using. They just heard the words trusted son and automatically assumed the millions were already resting safely in their bank accounts. Sterling continued reading the standard boilerplate legal language, outlining the initial inventory of the estate, including the childhood house, the investment portfolios, and the vintage furnishings. He was deliberately stretching the moment out, letting their false confidence build to an absolute fever pitch. But Declan was far too arrogant and far too impatient to simply sit there and let a lawyer finish speaking. He could not wait another single second to assert his dominance over me. Right in the middle of Sterling, reading a clause about property maintenance. Declan suddenly cleared his throat loudly and held up his hand, interrupting a senior partner at a major law firm without a single ounce of respect. Declan announced that we could probably skip over all the boring legal jargon about maintaining the property because he already had everything completely handled. He reached down into a sleek leather architectural portfolio he had brought with him and pulled out a thick, heavy tube of rolled-up paper. With a loud, dramatic flick of his wrist, he tossed the tube directly onto the center of the pristine glass table. The heavy paper unrolled itself, revealing a massive, highly detailed set of architectural blueprints. I stared at the blueprints, feeling my stomach violently churn. The plans were completely abhorrent. They detailed a total aggressive demolition of our childhood home. But the most sickening part was the backyard. For 40 years, my mother had meticulously cultivated a stunning award-winning rose garden. It was her sanctuary, her absolute pride and joy. I had spent countless hours sitting with her in that garden, listening to her stories while she pruned the climbing roses. On the blueprints, her beautiful garden was entirely crossed out with thick red marker replaced by a massive, soulless concrete patio, a built-in luxury outdoor kitchen, and a giant fire pit designed specifically for Jasmine to host her tacky networking parties. Jasmine leaned forward, resting her elbows aggressively on the table. She traced her finger over the blueprints, her expensive rings clinking against the glass. She looked directly at me, her eyes gleaming with a malicious, hateful joy. She told me that since they were going to have the bulldozers completely level the backyard, by next Tuesday morning, they would not need any of the old landscaping equipment. She smirked a cruel, ugly expression that completely twisted her perfectly made-up face. She suggested that if I hurried up and went to the house before the demolition crew arrived, I could maybe dig up a single potted plant to take with me to whatever cheap, dirty apartment I eventually ended up renting. She literally offered me a single handful of dirt as a pathetic souvenir while she sat there plotting to pave over my mother life work with cold concrete. The sheer level of absolute cruelty in her voice was almost suffocating. A younger version of me would have snapped. I would have screamed at her for disrespecting a woman who was barely even cold in her grave. I would have lunged across that glass table and ripped those disgusting blueprints into a million tiny shreds. I felt the hot, familiar burn of rage flooding my chest, my heart hammering fiercely against my ribs. But I did not move a single muscle. I did not shed a single tear. I remembered the heavy weight of the hidden trust documents currently sitting inside Sterling Davis' folder. I remembered my mother's steady voice telling me to have a spine of steel. I remembered that I was not the victim here. I was the one holding the absolute authority to completely ruin them. So I simply looked at Jasmine and I did not say a word. I let the heavy, uncomfortable silence stretch out across the massive conference room. I let her sit there, basking in her premature victory, completely unaware that she was standing on a trapdoor that was about to violently swing open. I looked at Declan, who was grinning like a lottery winner watching his wife brutally humiliate his only sister. I stared at them with a completely stoic, unbreakable expression, giving them every single inch of rope they needed to hang themselves. I waited patiently for the exact moment when Sterling Davis would finally stop reading the outdated bait and flip the page to the irrevocable blind trust. I sat perfectly still, allowing them to fully enjoy their last remaining seconds of fake wealth before the absolute brutal reality of federal wire fraud and complete financial ruin came crashing down on their heads. The heavy silence in the massive conference room stretched out for what felt like an absolute eternity. Jasmine sat there, with her elbows resting aggressively on the pristine glass table, her manicured fingers tapping a slow, arrogant rhythm against the surface. She had just offered me a single potted plant from my mother-ruined garden as a pathetic souvenir, and she was visibly basking in her own cruelty. She expected me to cry. She expected me to break down completely and beg for mercy in front of the high-powered attorney. Declan was leaning back in his heavy leather chair, grinning from ear to ear, radiating the unchecked confidence of a man who believed he had just successfully conquered the entire world. He looked at his expensive gold watch and let out a loud theatrical sigh, making a grand show of how bored he was with this entire trivial process. He actually reached down to grab the shiny leather portfolio containing his aggressive demolition blueprints, entirely ready to stand up and order the building security guards to drag me out into the street exactly as he had promised in the waiting room. Sterling Davis did not say a single word for a long, agonizing moment. He simply sat at the head of the long mahogany and glass table, watching them with the cold, unblinking eyes of a seasoned apex predator who had completely cornered his prey. He slowly and methodically closed the thin manila folder containing the outdated decoy will that he had just read. He pressed his palms flat against the smooth glass surface of the table and leaned forward just a fraction of an inch. His silence was so heavy and so deeply intentional that the smug, arrogant smile on Declan's face slowly began to falter. The quiet tapping of Jasmine manicured nails against the glass came to a sudden, abrupt halt. The entire atmosphere in the room shifted instantly, dropping 10 degrees as the sheer gravity of Sterling's completely unbothered demeanor began to suffocate them. Declan cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably in his expensive chair, suddenly realizing that the high-powered attorney had absolutely no intention of concluding the meeting. Sterling reached down into the thick leather briefcase resting beside his chair. He did not pull out another standard legal file. Instead, he withdrew the heavy, textured ivory envelope sealed with the thick, dark red wax crest. It was the exact same envelope I had pulled from the freezing metal safety deposit box in Oak Ridge just days ago. The envelope my mother had meticulously prepared with her own hands. Sterling placed the ivory envelope perfectly in the center of his blotter. He looked directly at Declan, his gaze completely, entirely devoid of any human warmth. He stated in a voice that commanded absolute, undeniable authority that the preliminary document he had just read was executed exactly 7 years ago. He explained that while it was a lovely, sentimental reflection of how Barbara once viewed her family, it was entirely and completely legally void. Declan's face tightened, his thick eyebrows pulled together in deep, sudden confusion. He opened his mouth to speak, to protest, to loudly remind the attorney that he held the sole financial power of attorney, but Sterling simply raised one single index finger, stopping the arrogant man dead in his tracks. Sterling explained that my mother was one of the most profoundly intelligent and fiercely perceptive clients he had ever represented in his entire 30-year legal career. He told Declan that Barbara knew exactly what was happening inside her own home, and she knew exactly how her assets were being secretly manipulated. He stated that 3 years ago, shortly after receiving her terminal medical diagnosis, Barbara drove herself to this exact office, sat in this exact leather chair, and executed a masterful, comprehensive restructuring of her entire earthly estate. She did this completely in secret, specifically to protect her legacy from the very people who were currently sitting at this table, treating her death like a lucrative real estate transaction. With deliberate, agonizing slowness, Sterling picked up a silver letter opener. He slid the blade under the thick red wax seal and sliced the ivory envelope open. The sharp, tearing sound of the heavy parchment paper echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. Declan stopped breathing. Jasmine dropped her hands into her lap, her rigid posture completely collapsing as a sudden, terrible realization began to wash over her face. Sterling pulled out the thick stack of original notarized documents. He smoothed the heavy pages flat against the glass table and put his expensive reading glasses back on. He announced that he was now going to officially read the legally binding and fully uncontestable terms of the Barbara Myers Irrevocable Blind Trust. Sterling did not rush a single syllable. He weaponized every single word, making absolutely sure they inflicted maximum psychological damage. He began by clearly detailing the exact legal definition of the trust. He explained that an irrevocable blind trust is a completely impenetrable legal fortress. Once it is established and funded, the assets placed inside it are entirely shielded from the standard probate court process. They cannot be challenged by disgruntled relatives, they cannot be seized by outside creditors, and they completely and absolutely supersede any previously established wills or general powers of attorney. Sterling looked directly into Declan's eyes and delivered the first devastating blow. He stated that the power of attorney Declan had been using to parade around the local bank branches had been formally legally revoked by Barbara exactly 3 years ago. The document Declan possessed was nothing more than a worthless piece of scrap paper. He had absolutely zero legal authority over Barbara's life, her medical decisions, or her finances for the last 36 months. I watched the color completely drain from my brother's face. His arrogant, sun-kissed complexion turned a sickly, ashen gray. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. He was beginning to realize that the massive foundation of lies he had built his entire fake millionaire lifestyle upon had just disintegrated into dust. But Sterling was not even close to being finished. He turned to the second page of the thick document and began reading the formal inventory of the trust assets. He read the exact address of our childhood home, stating clearly that the deed to the property and the surrounding land, including the award-winning Rose Garden Jasmine was planning to bulldoze, had been fully transferred into the trust 3 years ago. The house did not belong to the estate. It belonged entirely to the trust. Then Sterling flipped to the third page, and the room became so quiet I could actually hear the gentle hum of the building air conditioning system. Sterling announced the existence of a highly secure, previously undisclosed private wealth management portfolio. He detailed how Barbara had quietly liquidated several old forgotten accounts and brilliantly invested the capital over the last decade, completely hiding it from Declan's greedy, intrusive eyes. Sterling read the final verified balance of the hidden portfolio. It was exactly $2,400,000 in highly diversified, extremely stable mutual funds and municipal bonds. Jasmine let out a sharp, audible gasp, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. $2 million. They had absolutely no idea that kind of massive generational wealth even existed in our family. They thought they were fighting over a simple suburban house and a checking account. They had completely underestimated the brilliant financial mind of the woman they had treated like a senile burden. Sterling paused, letting the massive multi-million-dollar figure hang heavy and suffocating in the cold air. He looked at the two of them, watching them practically salivate over the massive fortune they desperately believed was about to be dropped directly into their laps. They were both physically leaning across the glass table, their eyes wide and completely unblinking, waiting for Sterling to announce their names. They truly still believed that somehow, someway, this incredible secret fortune was going to belong to them. They believed they were the rightful heirs to the kingdom. Sterling turned to the final page of the document. He cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses one final time. He announced that he was now reading Clause 7, the formal and irrevocable designation of the sole beneficiary and absolute legal executor of the trust. He read the words slowly, loudly, and with absolute devastating clarity. The document stated that the entirety of the irrevocable blind trust, including the deed to the primary residence, the complete $2,400,000 investment portfolio, and all vintage family heirlooms within the property, were bequeathed entirely, unequivocally, and solely to her beloved daughter, Harper Myers. The document explicitly mandated that Declan Myers was to be permanently and entirely excluded from any and all inheritance, completely disinherited, and legally barred from stepping foot on the physical property ever again. The silence that followed the reading of Clause 7 was absolute pure cinematic shock. It was the kind of deafening silence that happens right after a massive bomb detonates before the sound waves finally hit your ears. Time completely stopped in that corner office. I sat perfectly still in my thrift store blazer, my hands folded calmly in my lap, feeling a profound, overwhelming sense of absolute peace settling deep into my soul. I looked across the table at the people who had thrown me out into the freezing rain. Declan had completely stopped breathing. His eyes were wide and completely vacant, staring blindly at the thick stack of papers resting under Sterling's hands. The blood had entirely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified, empty shell of a man. His mouth was hanging wide open, but his vocal cords were completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his total financial destruction. He had spent his entire adult life acting like the superior golden child, treating me like a pathetic, useless servant. He had stolen from our dying mother and planned to literally throw me out onto the street. And in one single, quiet sentence, a lawyer had just legally handed me the absolute ownership of his entire perceived universe. Jasmine was visibly trembling. Her designer sunglasses slid off her head and clattered loudly onto the glass table, but she did not even flinch. She was staring at me with a look of pure, unadulterated horror. The smug, arrogant woman who had casually offered me $500 to run away and hide just a few days ago was now staring at the sole multi-million-dollar owner of the estate she had been planning to exploit. The realization that she had spent thousands of dollars hiring contractors and buying a luxury Porsche SUV based on a completely fake inheritance was physically crushing her. Suddenly, the paralyzing shock shattered. The absolute reality of his complete ruin finally crashed into Declan's brain. He let out a loud, guttural sound that was half gasp and half terrified scream. He violently leaped out of his heavy leather chair, knocking it backwards so hard it crashed into the mahogany paneled wall behind him. He slammed both of his fists down onto the polished glass conference table with such incredible explosive force that the thick glass actually shuddered and my water glass violently tipped over, spilling ice across the surface. He leaned over the table, his face contorted into a mask of pure, absolute, terrifying rage. The veins in his neck were bulging and his eyes were wild and completely unhinged. He pointed a shaking, aggressive finger directly at Sterling Davis and then whipped his hand around to point directly at my calm, stoic face. He screamed at the absolute top of his lungs, his voice cracking and echoing wildly throughout the massive luxury office. He screamed that it was a complete lie. He screamed that the documents were a massive, illegal forgery. He yelled that our mother would never completely disinherit her only son and hand millions of dollars to a pathetic, lazy failure. He slammed his fists on the table again, demanding that Sterling immediately throw those fake papers in the trash. He lost total, complete, and utter control, thrashing against the inescapable, ironclad reality of the brilliant trap our mother had built for him. I sat perfectly still in my worn navy blazer, watching my brother completely unravel in front of me. Declan was panting heavily, his chest heaving under his expensive, tailored suit. He slammed his hands against the thick glass table again and again, demanding that Sterling Davis throw the documents away. He was screaming so loudly that his voice was cracking, echoing off the mahogany walls of the luxury corner office. He called me a liar. He called our dead mother a crazy old woman. He insisted that the irrevocable blind trust was a massive illegal forgery that I had somehow completely fabricated to steal his rightful inheritance. I just watched him. I did not flinch when his spit flew across the table. I did not shrink back into my chair when he pointed his aggressive, shaking finger directly at my face. For 28 years, I had let this man make me feel like I was absolutely nothing. I had spent the last 5 years quietly wiping our mother's forehead and administering her medications while he paraded around town acting like a self-made real estate tycoon. But looking at him right now, I did not see a powerful man. I saw a terrified, pathetic little boy who had just realized his entire fake universe was crumbling into dust. The silence in the room stretched out cold and unforgiving as Declan finally ran out of breath. He stood over the table, gripping the edges with white knuckles, waiting for me to break down and confess that it was all a big misunderstanding. But I did not break. I slowly reached down into my damp purse. I pulled out the printed banking records I had secured earlier this week. I placed the crisp white papers on the smooth glass surface, and with one calm, deliberate motion, I slid them directly across the table until they hit Declan's fingertips. I finally spoke, my voice perfectly level and completely stripped of any emotion. I told him to look at the paper. I told him to look at the exact date and the exact time of the transaction printed on the very top line. Declan looked down, his angry red face suddenly shifting into a mask of pure confusion. He was staring at the undeniable digital record of the $32,450 wire transfer he had made to his own business checking account. I kept my eyes locked directly on his. I told him that while he was busy ignoring our mother calls, while she was taking her final agonizing breaths in her hospice bed, I knew exactly what he was doing. I told him he thought he was incredibly clever, wiping out the joint medical fund before she even died. I told him he thought he was seizing the cash before the estate went into probate. But I revealed the absolute truth. I told him that our mother knew exactly how greedy and heartless he truly was. I explained that she deliberately left that specific bank account open and completely fully funded as a brilliant, undeniable trap. She left the money sitting there like bait because she knew he would absolutely not be able to resist taking it the second he thought she was too weak to stop him. Declan swallowed hard, his throat bobbing nervously. He tried to stammer out a defense. He claimed he had the legal power of attorney. He claimed he had the absolute right to move those funds to secure the estate assets. But before he could finish his pathetic lie, Sterling Davis stepped in, delivering the absolute fatal kill shot. Sterling reached into his thick leather briefcase and pulled out a fresh, pristine manila folder. He opened it and slid a formal, heavily drafted document across the glass table right next to the bank records. Sterling spoke with the cold, ruthless efficiency of a predator. He informed Declan that the document he was currently looking at was a fully drafted, completely finalized criminal complaint ready to be submitted directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the local district attorney office. Sterling explained the law with terrifying clarity. He told Declan that because Barbara had secretly and legally revoked his power of attorney exactly 3 years ago, Declan had zero legal authority to touch a single dime of her money. Sterling leaned forward, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. He told Declan that logging into a banking portal with a completely revoked credential and transferring $32,000 across state lines to a private commercial account was not a simple family dispute. It was a textbook, undeniable case of federal wire fraud. Sterling promised my brother that the paper trail was absolutely flawless. There was no defense. There was no loophole. He told Declan he was looking at a minimum of 5 to 10 years in a federal penitentiary for exploiting a vulnerable, dying woman. The blood completely, instantly drained from Jasmine's face. She had been standing frozen behind Declan, but the words federal wire fraud absolutely shattered her glamorous facade. She looked down at the drafted police report, and then she looked at the bank statements. The devastating reality of their situation slammed into her like a freight train. She realized in one horrifying second that Declan did not have millions of dollars waiting in probate. He did not own a massive suburban estate. He was completely broke, and worse, he was a documented felon. Jasmine's hands started shaking violently. She looked at her husband with absolute disgust and pure, unadulterated panic. She started hyperventilating her voice, rising to a shrill, hysterical pitch. She yelled at Declan, asking him what he had done. She reminded him in front of the entire room that they had just signed high-interest financing paperwork for a brand-new luxury Porsche SUV yesterday afternoon. She screamed that she had already paid non-refundable cash deposits to luxury contractors to gut the backyard and demolish the rose garden next week. She had leveraged their entire future on a fake inheritance, and now she was legally married to a man who was about to go to federal prison. The multi-million-dollar real estate empire she thought she was marrying into was a complete and total illusion. I watched their marriage absolutely implode right there in the law office. They turned on each other instantly, exactly like cornered animals. Declan tried to grab Jasmine's arm to quiet her down, but she slapped his hand away, looking at him like he was a diseased rat. I let them panic for a full minute before I finally stood up from my leather chair. My movement instantly silenced the room. I looked at the two of them standing there in their expensive designer clothes, utterly bankrupt and entirely at my absolute mercy. I did not raise my voice, but every single word I spoke felt like a heavy stone dropping into a quiet pond. I told Declan that he had exactly 2 hours. I told him he had exactly 120 minutes to drive back to my house, pack whatever cheap personal items he could fit into the trunk of that luxury car he could no longer afford, and get off my property forever. I told him that if I drove up to my house at exactly 4:00 this afternoon and saw his face, I would dial 911 and have him arrested for trespassing. I told him that if one single petal in my mother rose garden was touched, if one single vintage heirloom was missing from the mantle, or if he attempted to take a single dime of the remaining trust money, I would immediately instruct Sterling to submit that massive fraud file directly to the federal authorities. I looked directly into Jasmine's terrified eyes and told her that if she ever spoke to me again, I would make absolutely sure she shared a prison cell with her fraudulent husband. I picked up my purse, turned my back on the two people who had ruined my 20s, and walked out of the conference room. I left them standing there in the cold silence of their complete and total destruction, knowing my mother was looking down, smiling. As I walked down the long mahogany hallway, I felt a sudden, overwhelming rush of pure freedom. The heavy, suffocating weight I had carried for 5 years was completely gone. I stepped onto the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby. I thought about the massive investment portfolio waiting for me. I thought about the childhood home I now legally owned. I thought about the beautiful, pristine rose garden that would never be paved over with cold concrete. My mother had given me the ultimate gift. She had not just secured my financial future, she had given me my life back. I walked out of the building and into the crisp afternoon air, completely ready to begin again. Have you ever had to draw a hard line with someone who thought they could completely walk all over you? Let me know in the comments below. If you loved hearing how this absolute nightmare finally got the justice they deserved, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories just like this one. Tell me what city you are watching from, and I will see you in the next story. The heavy mahogany doors of the conference room felt like they had sealed us inside an airtight vacuum. Sterling Davis had just dropped the ultimate bombshell, and the terrifying echoes of federal wire fraud were still actively vibrating against the expensive glass walls. I sat in my thrift store navy blazer, with my hands folded neatly in my lap. I did not move a single muscle. I just watched the absolute total destruction of my brother's fake empire unfold in real time. The silence that immediately followed Sterling's legal threat was so profound it was almost deafening. It was the devastating sound of a massive, towering delusion finally crashing into hard concrete reality. I shifted my gaze away from Declan's terrified face and looked directly at Jasmine. The physical transformation was absolutely breathtaking. Just 20 minutes ago, she had strutted into this luxury office suite like she owned the entire downtown skyline. She had mocked my clothes and gleefully offered me a single potted plant from my mother-ruined garden. She had been vibrating with the arrogant thrill of a woman who honestly thought she was about to inherit millions of dollars. But now the pristine white designer suit she wore suddenly looked like a cheap wrinkled costume. The vibrant, confident color had completely drained from her flawless face, leaving behind a sickening, chalky pallor. Her mouth was parted slightly, her breath coming in short, rapid gasps as her brain frantically tried to process the massive legal crater her husband had just shoved them both into. She looked down at the drafted police report, sitting innocently on the glass table. She looked at the bank statements showing the stolen $32,000. Then she slowly turned her head and looked at Declan. It was not a look of wifely concern or shared panic. It was a look of pure, unadulterated horror and rapidly mounting revulsion. She was staring at a complete stranger. For their entire relationship, Declan had aggressively sold her a very specific, highly curated narrative. He had painted himself as the brilliant, successful heir to a massive suburban real estate dynasty. He had thoroughly convinced her that my mother was just a senile obstacle and that I was nothing more than a pathetic freeloader taking up space in their future mansion. He had promised her generational wealth and absolute financial security. He had lied to her with every single breath he took. Jasmine's hands began to tremble so violently that the heavy gold bracelets on her wrists clinked together. The sharp metallic sound shattered the suffocating silence in the room. "You lied to me," she whispered. Her voice was barely audible at first, thick with profound shock and a rapidly rising tide of absolute panic. She pushed her chair back from the glass table, the heavy leather scraping loudly against the marble floor. "You told me you had the legal authority, Declan. You told me the power of attorney was ironclad. You told me your mother begged you to take control of the estate before she died." Declan visibly panicked. The dominant alpha male facade he had meticulously maintained his entire adult life completely evaporated into thin air. He looked exactly like a cornered, terrified child. He reached out his hands, shaking desperately, trying to grab Jasmine's arm to quiet her down. "Jasmine, please," he stammered, his voice cracking under the intense, crushing pressure of the room. "Jasmine, we can fix this. Just calm down and let me talk to the lawyer. We can figure out a strategy. We just need to negotiate a private settlement." "Do not touch me," Jasmine shrieked violently, slapping his hand away. Her voice escalated from a shocked whisper into a piercing, hysterical scream that echoed wildly off the rich mahogany panels. "Do not you ever put your hands on me again, you absolute fraud. Fix this. You think you can fix this?" She pointed a trembling manicured finger directly at the drafted criminal complaint resting in front of Sterling. "That is a federal criminal report, Declan. The lawyer just told you that you committed federal wire fraud. You stole money from a dying woman using a revoked legal document. You do not have a brilliant strategy. You have a massive prison sentence." The sheer volume of her panic was absolutely glorious to witness. I sat perfectly still, my face completely stoic, letting every single second of their abject misery wash over me. This was the exact, precise justice my mother had orchestrated from her hospice bed. She knew that a marriage built entirely on shallow greed and deep deception would instantly, spontaneously combust the absolute second the money disappeared. Jasmine paced back and forth in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows, her expensive red-bottomed heels clicking frantically against the marble floor like a ticking time bomb. She was heavily hyperventilating, her chest heaving as the massive financial reality of her situation completely crushed her. "We just signed the financing paperwork for a $140,000 Porsche SUV yesterday afternoon," she screamed, her voice shrill and vibrating with pure terror. "We gave the dealership a $50,000 cash down payment. You told me that money was an early legal disbursement from your mother estate. You told me it was completely clean. You let me sign my name on those high-interest loan documents, knowing you were a broke, unemployed felon using stolen hospice funds." Declan's face flushed a dark, angry crimson. The sheer fear in his eyes was rapidly being replaced by the ugly, defensive rage of a true narcissist who has finally been caught in his own web of lies. He stood up from his chair, pointing an aggressive, shaking finger back at his wife. "Do not you dare stand there and act like some innocent victim in all of this. Jasmine," he yelled, his voice booming through the cold conference room. "You are the exact one who constantly pushed me for more money. You are the one who complained every single day about needing a massive luxury house to impress your shallow, pathetic real estate friends. You're the one who booked those expensive demolition contractors to gut my mother garden before she was even legally buried. You wanted the millionaire lifestyle, and I was just trying to give you exactly what you constantly demanded. You are pathetic." Jasmine spat back, her face completely contorted in a mask of absolute revulsion. "You are a weak, pathetic little man who had to steal from his sick, dying mother just to pretend he was successful. You told me you were a tycoon. You told me Harper was just a lazy freeloader who contributed absolutely nothing to the world. But she is sitting right there legally owning a multi-million-dollar trust fund, while you do not even own the cheap suit you are currently wearing. You have absolutely nothing. You are nothing." The argument quickly escalated into a vicious, brutal display of absolute mutual hatred. They stood in the center of that pristine luxury law office, tearing each other completely apart. They aired every single dirty secret, every greedy motivation, and every selfish, ugly lie they had ever told each other during their entire relationship. Sterling Davis sat at the head of the table, observing them with cold professional detachment. He did not interrupt their screaming match. He simply let them verbally destroy their entire marriage, while I watched silently from the far end of the table. I felt a deep, profound sense of complete peace. For 5 long, agonizing years, they had made me feel like I was the broken, defective member of this family. They had mocked my daily sacrifices and treated my total devotion to our mother like a pathetic, embarrassing character flaw. But looking at them right now, completely unraveling over the absolute loss of a massive fortune they never actually earned, I realized they were the ones who were entirely, fundamentally broken. Jasmine suddenly stopped pacing. She stood completely still, her chest heaving as she stared at the man she had married. The wild panic in her eyes was suddenly replaced by a cold, highly calculating survival instinct. She was a ruthless opportunist at her core, and she clearly knew a rapidly sinking ship when she saw one. She looked down at the massive diamond engagement ring and the matching diamond wedding band heavily glittering on her left hand. Declan had proposed to her right after he forced our mother to sign that fraudulent power of attorney. The diamonds were highly likely paid for with stolen, vulnerable money. Jasmine slowly reached for her left hand. Declan watched her, his eyes widening in fresh, absolute terror as he realized exactly what she was about to do. "Jasmine." "No," he pleaded, his voice dropping to a desperate, pathetic whispering, "Please, Jasmine, do not do this right now. We are a team. We are supposed to be partners in this. We can hire a brilliant criminal defense lawyer. We can fight this together. Please do not walk out on me. I am not a partner to a federal criminal." Jasmine stated, her voice dripping with absolute chilling venom. "I am a licensed real estate professional with a flawless reputation to maintain in this city. I will not let you drag me down into the dirty mud with you. I will absolutely not go to a federal penitentiary because you were too utterly stupid to realize your own mother was actively setting a trap for you. I am completely, entirely done with you, Declan. I will be filing for an absolute immediate annulment first thing Monday morning on the grounds of severe financial fraud and deliberate criminal deception." She grabbed the heavy diamond rings and aggressively pulled them off her finger. She did not hand them to him gently. She raised her hand and violently threw the heavy jewelry directly at his chest. The rings hit Declan's suit jacket and dropped onto the thick glass conference table with a sharp, loud clatter that violently echoed through the entire room. The diamonds sparkled brightly under the harsh office lights, serving as a perfect physical symbol of their completely shattered fake marriage. Jasmine did not spare him another single glance. She turned on her expensive red-bottomed heels and marched directly toward the heavy mahogany doors. She did not look at me. She did not look at Sterling Davis. She simply grabbed the brass handle and pulled the heavy door open, marching out into the hallway with the desperate, frantic speed of a woman fleeing a burning building. The heavy wooden door swung shut behind her, sealing with a loud, definitive, authoritative click. The silence violently rushed back into the room, heavier and far more suffocating than before. Declan stood entirely alone in the very center of the massive office. The arrogant golden child, the man who had confidently threatened to have building security, drag me out into the street just an hour ago, was completely physically broken. His broad shoulders slumped heavily forward, his expensive tailored suit suddenly looking way too large for his rapidly deflating frame. He stared completely blankly at the 2 diamond rings resting silently on the cold glass table. His breathing became incredibly erratic, shifting into a loud, ragged, terrifying hyperventilation. He clutched his chest, his trembling fingers gripping the expensive fabric of his shirt as his lungs desperately fought for oxygen in the sterile room. He was entirely, totally isolated in the world. He had no wife to support him, no mother to exploit, no sister to bully, no luxury house to sell, and absolutely no money to hide behind. He had absolutely nothing left but the terrifying, undeniable reality of the federal wire fraud charges waiting to completely consume whatever pathetic remnants of his life remained. I sat perfectly still in my leather chair, watching him actively struggle to breathe, feeling absolutely no pity at all in my heart. I merged onto the busy downtown highway, feeling completely and entirely weightless. The damp Seattle air rushing through the slightly cracked window of my battered 12-year-old sedan felt absolutely different now. It smelled exactly like pure, unadulterated freedom. Just 5 agonizing days ago, I had driven this exact same route, blinded by hot, terrified tears gripping the steering wheel in sheer, absolute panic, because I honestly thought my entire life was completely over. I thought I was a pathetic, homeless orphan, completely discarded by the only family I had left in the world. I had believed every single cruel word my brother had aggressively thrown at me. But today, I was driving back to my childhood home, not as a disposable, exhausted freeloader, but as the sole, unquestionable legal owner of a multi-million-dollar estate. My brilliant mother had orchestrated the most flawless, absolute trap from her dying hospice bed, and it had worked with devastating, breathtaking perfection. I gripped the worn leather steering wheel, feeling the solid, undeniable truth of my new reality settling deep into my chest. I owned the house. I owned the massive $2 million investment portfolio. I owned my entire future, and Declan was completely, utterly, and entirely ruined. I turned off the busy main road and navigated onto the familiar, quiet, tree-lined suburban street. The massive ancient oak trees my mother had lovingly planted 40 years ago lined the sidewalk, standing tall, like silent, loyal sentinels, welcoming me back to where I truly belonged. As I slowly pulled up to the edge of the long driveway, I immediately noticed that Jasmine's brand new black luxury Porsche SUV was already completely gone. She had entirely abandoned him, exactly as she had ruthlessly promised in the law office. She had fled the scene of his massive financial crime, leaving him totally isolated to face the absolute destruction of his fake empire alone. But Declan's sleek silver, leased BMW, was still parked haphazardly on the front lawn. Next to his car were 2 large white commercial vans belonging to the expensive luxury landscaping company Jasmine had hired to violently bulldoze my mother's award-winning rose garden. The rugged contractors were standing around the driveway, looking incredibly confused, holding thick wooden clipboards and pointing at the house. I parked my old sedan right in the absolute center of the driveway, completely blocking the silver BMW from moving an inch. I stepped out of my car and walked directly up to the confused, burly construction foreman. I looked him dead in his eyes and calmly informed him that the property had just formally changed legal ownership and that all aggressive demolition contracts signed by either Declan or Jasmine Myers were immediately and permanently canceled. I told him in a voice made of pure steel to pack up his heavy equipment, take his crew, and leave my property right this very second. The foreman took one long look at my absolute, unshakable confidence, nodded respectfully without a single argument, and immediately ordered his men back into their loud white vans. I watched them drive away, securing the absolute safety of my mother's beautiful sanctuary. I turned around and walked up the familiar concrete porch steps, my low thrift store heels clicking with a steady, powerful authority against the stone. The heavy solid oak front door was wide open, completely unlocked and unguarded. I stepped inside the grand foyer, and the absolute chaotic scene that unfolded in front of me was the most profound display of sheer poetic justice I had ever witnessed in my entire life. The beautiful, pristine living room that my mother had kept perfectly clean for decades was a complete and total disaster area. Declan was frantically running back and forth between the sprawling master bedroom and the front hallway like a trapped, terrified animal. He was heavily sweating, his face flushed a dark, panicked crimson. His expensive, custom-tailored charcoal suit jacket was thrown carelessly on the floor like a piece of cheap garbage, and his silk tie was completely unknotted and hanging loosely around his neck. He was breathing in heavy, ragged, terrified gasps. But the absolute best part, the incredible specific detail that almost made me laugh out loud in the quiet hallway, was exactly what he was frantically holding in his trembling hands. Declan was aggressively clutching a heavy roll of thick black industrial garbage bags. He was violently ripping the plastic bags off the roll and frantically shoving his expensive designer Italian shoes, his luxury silver watches, and his custom-pressed shirts directly into the cheap, flimsy plastic. He was packing his belongings exactly the same way he had packed mine just 5 days ago. The wealthy, aggressive real estate tycoon, who had gleefully tossed my entire life onto the porch, was now desperately stuffing his own pathetic, fraudulent reality into trash bags before his 2-hour deadline expired. He was completely terrified. He knew with absolute certainty that the second the clock struck 4:00, I was going to call Sterling Davis and hand the undeniable wire fraud evidence directly over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He was packing like a man running for his absolute life because he was desperately trying to gather whatever pathetic remnants of his fake wealthy lifestyle he could carry before the federal authorities completely locked him away in a concrete cell. I stood quietly in the archway of the living room, leaning slightly against the wooden doorframe, just watching him physically tear his own life apart. He was so entirely consumed by his own absolute blind panic that he did not even realize I was standing right there, observing his total humiliation. He rushed across the room and violently tripped over a pile of expensive leather belts, cursing loudly and viciously, kicking a small wooden chair across the carpeted floor. He grabbed another heavy, black garbage bag from the roll and spun around, freezing completely dead in his tracks when he finally saw me standing in the doorway. The heavy plastic bag instantly slipped out of his trembling, sweaty hands and hit the hardwood floor with a soft, pathetic thud. The absolute stark terror in his eyes was instantly replaced by a desperate, sickeningly sweet manipulation. The arrogant, aggressive bully completely vanished into thin air, and the pathetic, begging coward instantly took his place. "Harper," he gasped, his voice cracking and trembling with sheer pathetic desperation. "Harper, please, you have to listen to me. You have to stop this." I took a slow, deliberate step into the living room, my face completely blank, my entire posture radiating absolute, unwavering steel. I looked down at the ugly black garbage bags completely surrounding his expensive leather shoes. I noted how incredibly quickly the mighty golden child had completely and totally fallen. Declan took a hesitant, shaking step toward me, holding his hands up in a placating, begging gesture. "Harper, please do not do this," he pleaded, actual hot tears welling up in his dark, desperate eyes. "We can fix this whole misunderstanding. I can give the $32,000 back to the estate. I will get a high-interest bank loan. I will sell the silver BMW. I will sell all my expensive watches. I will pay back every single solitary dime I took from the hospice account. Just please, please do not send those criminal documents to the authorities. You cannot send your own brother to a federal prison. We are a family, Harper. We are blood. Mom would absolutely never want this to happen to us. She would want us to forgive each other and be a loving, supportive family." I stared at him, feeling absolutely no pity, no warmth, and absolutely no familial obligation whatsoever. I remembered the exact cold, cruel tone he had used when he smugly texted me that the locks on this very door had been completely changed. I remembered how he had viciously laughed while I cried in the freezing rain. I remembered him aggressively demanding that I pay him back for the exact same garbage bags he used to throw my entire life out onto the wet concrete street. He was only invoking our mother memory because he was absolutely backed into a corner and facing total, inescapable federal ruin. I looked directly into his red, tear-filled, pleading eyes, and I spoke with a calm, chilling, absolute finality that froze the very air in the room. "Do not you ever speak her name to me again," I said, my voice low and incredibly dangerous. "You did not care about family when you deliberately stole her private medical money. You did not care about blood when you illegally threw me out into the street. You treated our dying mother like a senile, burdensome obstacle, and you treated me like disposable, pathetic trash. You made your own greedy choices, Declan. Now you get to live with the absolute devastating consequences." Declan completely collapsed. He literally fell to his knees, dropping heavily onto the expensive hardwood floor right in the absolute middle of his scattered garbage bags and began openly, violently sobbing. He clasped his hands tightly together, bowing his head and begging me for a second chance, begging me for a tiny ounce of mercy, but my heart was a complete, impenetrable fortress. I looked down at the pathetic, broken man sobbing at my feet, and I repeated the exact same vicious words he had casually thrown at me just 5 days ago. I let the words hang in the air, sharp, cold, and completely unforgiving. "Get out!" Declan sobbed harder, burying his face deep into his shaking hands. But my strict 2-hour ultimatum was completely, absolutely non-negotiable. Right on cue, the sharp flashing red and blue lights of a local police cruiser suddenly illuminated the large front bay windows of the living room, casting long dancing shadows across the walls. I had not just trusted him to voluntarily leave. I had called the non-emergency police line while sitting in the law firm parking garage, formally reporting a hostile, aggressive trespasser at my legal residence. 2 large uniformed police officers walked heavily up the front porch steps, their thick boots loudly announcing their arrival. I turned to them, holding up the certified legal documents Sterling Davis had provided, completely proving I was the sole legal owner of the property. I pointed down at the sobbing, pathetic man kneeling on the floor surrounded by black plastic bags. I calmly and clearly informed the officers that this man had been formally legally evicted, was currently actively trespassing, and was completely refusing to vacate my private home. The officers did not hesitate for a single second. They stepped directly into the living room, grabbed Declan firmly by his expensive tailored arms, and hauled him violently to his feet. Declan tried to weakly resist screaming my name, begging the officers to just let him gather the rest of his expensive designer clothes from the closet. But the stern police officers simply handed him the 2 black garbage bags he had already filled and forcefully escorted him right out the front door. I walked out onto the porch and stood perfectly still, watching them physically march him down the long concrete driveway. I watched him stumble awkwardly over the pavement, his custom charcoal suit completely wrinkled and utterly ruined, frantically clutching 2 cheap plastic garbage bags tightly to his chest. He looked back at me one final time, his face completely broken, twisted in absolute sheer terror and profound total defeat. I did not wave. I did not blink. I did not show a single ounce of emotion. I simply watched the police officers force him off my property and onto the public sidewalk, exactly where he belonged. I reached out, grabbed the heavy brass handle of the front door, and pulled it firmly shut, locking it with a loud, deeply satisfying click. The massive house was entirely silent. The house was completely mine. The absolute nightmare was finally and permanently over. 3 months later, the morning air in Seattle finally lost its bitter winter chill. I sat on the back porch of my childhood home, holding a warm mug of chamomile tea, and watched the early sunlight completely transform the backyard. The award-winning rose garden that Jasmine had so eagerly wanted to destroy was absolutely thriving. The deep red and soft pink petals were in full vibrant bloom, climbing up the old wooden trellises exactly the way my mother had carefully trained them to grow. There was no cold concrete patio. There was no tacky, luxury fire pit. There was only the quiet, beautiful sanctuary my mother had spent 40 years creating. I took a deep, long breath of the fragrant floral air, feeling a profound sense of absolute peace that I had not experienced in over half a decade. The heavy, suffocating exhaustion that had completely defined my life as a full-time caregiver was entirely gone. In its place was a quiet, steady, unshakable strength. I owned this massive house completely free and clear of any debt. I owned the solid ground beneath my feet and the sturdy roof over my head, but more importantly, I finally owned my own life. I did not take the $2 million trust fund and immediately start buying luxury sports cars or expensive designer clothes. I had spent my entire life watching my brother desperately chase empty, flashy status symbols, and I knew exactly how hollow and pathetic that existence truly was. Instead, I used my mother's brilliant final gift to build something that actually mattered to the world. I took a small, carefully calculated portion of the investment portfolio and officially launched my own independent medical billing firm. I completely transformed my mother's old sewing room into a bright, highly professional home office. Because I intimately knew exactly how grueling and isolating it was to be a full-time caregiver, desperately trying to scrape together a living, I made a very specific, aggressive business decision. I intentionally recruited and hired other women who desperately needed flexible remote work. I employed single mothers who could not afford expensive daycare. I hired women actively caring for sick elderly parents and wives trying to quietly build their own independent financial safety nets. We handled incredibly complex medical billing codes for private healthcare clinics across the entire Pacific Northwest. I paid my team incredibly well, and I gave them the absolute total flexibility I had always been cruelly denied by the corporate world. My mother, Quiet Hidden Wealth, was now actively empowering an entire network of hardworking women who had previously been entirely overlooked and discarded by society. We were building real, sustainable financial independence far away from the toxic, controlling grip of aggressive, arrogant men. While my life was peacefully expanding into something beautiful and deeply meaningful, Declan's entire universe had completely and violently collapsed in on itself. Jasmine had stayed absolutely true to her vicious boardroom promise. The very next Monday morning, she filed for an immediate legal annulment, completely severing herself from his toxic, fraudulent mess. But she did not just walk away quietly. She completely legally insulated her own assets, leaving Declan entirely personally responsible for the massive, staggering debt they had recklessly accumulated during their premature victory lap. Because they were not legally entitled to a single dime of the estate, Declan was personally on the hook for the $32,000 he had stolen from the hospice account. He was legally bound to the predatory high-interest auto loan for the luxury Porsche SUV that the dealership quickly and ruthlessly repossessed, right out of his temporary apartment parking lot. He was relentlessly chased by angry, aggressive collection agencies, demanding payment for the massive luxury contractor cancellation fees. Without a college degree, without a legitimate professional work history, and without our mother house to use as free financial collateral, his fake millionaire facade shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Through a mutual acquaintance, I learned that the former golden child of the Myers family is now working a grueling minimum wage job. He spends his nights stocking heavy cardboard boxes on the overnight shift at a massive big box retail store on the gritty outer edge of the city. He lives in a tiny, cramped studio apartment, barely able to make his minimum monthly penalty payments. His custom-tailored suits have been completely replaced by a cheap polyester uniform, but the absolute best part of his total devastating downfall is the invisible heavy chain I left wrapped tightly around his neck. I never officially filed the police report for the federal wire fraud. I kept the heavily drafted legal documents securely locked inside my heavy metal safety deposit box at the bank. Declan wakes up every single day completely terrified. He works his brutal, exhausting overnight shifts, constantly looking over his shoulder, living in absolute sheer panic that today might be the exact day I finally decide to send those undeniable bank records directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Every time there is a loud, unexpected knock on his apartment door, his blood runs completely cold. He knows that his freedom rests entirely in the palm of my hand. He knows with absolute terrifying certainty that the pathetic disposable sister he once tried to violently throw out onto the wet concrete street is the only reason he is not currently sitting inside a cold federal penitentiary. I let him live in that dark, agonizing, constant fear. It is a far more fitting and profound punishment than simply locking him away in a jail cell. I spent 28 long years shrinking myself into the shadows just to make him feel big and powerful. Now I get to live a big, beautiful, deeply fulfilling life while he cowers in the quiet, terrifying shadows of his own making. Boundaries are not about cruel revenge. They are about complete, total survival and claiming your own inherent worth. If you have ever been the invisible scapegoat in your own family, I want you to know that your value is absolutely not determined by the toxic people who try to exploit your kindness. You do not have to accept their cruel rankings, and you absolutely do not have to be their collateral damage. You have the fundamental right to walk away, set an unbreakable boundary, and build a beautiful, thriving sanctuary of your very own. Thank you so much for listening to my story until the very end. Please take a quick second to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel if you believe true justice was finally served today. Drop a comment below, letting me know what city or country you are watching from right now and exactly what time it is there. Your amazing support means the absolute world to me. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you in the next video. For 28 long years, I lived under the suffocating and deeply ingrained delusion that blood was an absolutely unbreakable bond. Society constantly tells us from the moment we are born that family is absolutely everything. We are aggressively conditioned to believe that blood is infinitely thicker than water, and that we must unconditionally forgive the exact people who share our biological DNA, no matter how deeply or repeatedly they wound us. But I am here to tell you right now that this is an incredibly dangerous toxic myth, specifically designed to keep us permanently trapped in endless cycles of emotional abuse. True family does not systematically and casually dismantle your fragile self-esteem. True family does not constantly view your inherent kindness as a pathetic weakness to be aggressively exploited for their own selfish financial gain. The people who genuinely love and respect you will always fiercely protect your mental peace. They will absolutely never prey on your deepest vulnerabilities or violently force you to shrink your entire existence just so they can feel powerful and significant. When my own brother and his greedy wife tried to throw me out into the freezing street, they completely and permanently severed whatever tiny biological ties we had remaining. They proved with absolute certainty that shared genetics do not ever automatically guarantee loyalty, respect, or basic human decency. I spent so much of my precious life desperately trying to earn a permanent place at a family table where I was secretly despised and constantly belittled. I contorted my entire personality, twisted myself into agonizing knots, and silently swallowed my own heavy pain just to keep their fake peace. But setting an ironclad, unapologetic boundary was the absolute ultimate act of true self-care. Walking away permanently from the toxic, unhinged dynamics that defined my entire childhood was not an act of petty revenge or lingering bitterness. It was a mandatory act of profound self-preservation and deep personal respect. I finally realized that standing up for my own undeniable inherent worth was infinitely more important than blindly protecting the incredibly fragile egos of the very people who actively abused me. You absolutely do not owe your abusers endless second chances just because society falsely dictates that family is paramount. You owe yourself complete safety. You owe yourself pure, unadulterated peace. You owe yourself a beautiful life, totally free from constant dark manipulation and cruel emotional blackmail. The exact moment I officially stopped waiting for their impossible validation was the exact moment my real, beautiful life finally began. I chose to completely rebuild my entire existence on a massive foundation of solid, undeniable truth, rather than a fragile, crumbling house of cards held together by incredibly toxic family secrets. I forcefully reclaimed my stolen power the very second I fully accepted that I was entirely enough, completely on my own. You have the absolute human right to carefully construct a beautiful, thriving, peaceful sanctuary far away from anyone who refuses to genuinely value you. If you are listening to my voice right now, and you have ever had to make the incredibly painful and agonizing decision to permanently walk away from highly toxic family members just to violently protect your own mental peace, then you know exactly how impossibly heavy that choice truly feels. It is an absolutely terrifying, heartbreaking process to completely sever permanent ties with the exact people who were supposed to love and fiercely protect you unconditionally since the day you were born. But you also intimately know exactly how profoundly and beautifully liberating it feels when you finally step out from underneath their crushing, suffocating weight. It honestly feels like taking your very first real breath of crisp, fresh, clean air after drowning in toxic darkness for decades. I desperately want to hear your amazing personal stories today. Have you ever been aggressively pushed to your absolute ultimate breaking point where you finally had to draw a hard, uncompromising, solid line with a close relative? Have you ever had to bravely choose your own desperate survival over maintaining a fake, deeply toxic family dynamic? Please drop your personal experience in the comments section down below, because I absolutely promise you right now that I actively read every single one of them. Your stories continuously give me incredible personal strength, and they actively help build a powerful, supportive global community for countless other women who might be going through the exact same terrifying, lonely ordeal right this very minute. Openly sharing our difficult truths is exactly how we collectively break these horrible, toxic generational cycles for good. If my difficult personal journey deeply resonated with your own challenging life experiences, or if you simply believe that true, sweet, poetic justice was finally beautifully served in that dark corporate boardroom today, please firmly hit that like button right now to show your amazing, incredible support. Please make absolutely sure you actively subscribe to the channel and turn on the little notification bell so you never miss another deeply empowering story about strong, brave women taking back their absolute control. We are actively building something incredibly special here together, and I deeply, passionately want you to be a permanent, active part of it. And please do not ever forget to loudly tell me exactly what beautiful city, great state, or amazing country you are happily watching from today, and exactly what specific time it is currently there while you are actively listening to my voice. I absolutely love seeing exactly how far these stories travel across the world, magically connecting us all together. We are never truly alone in our struggles. Until we beautifully meet again next time, please always remember this one crucial, undeniable, ultimate truth. Your inherent human value and your absolute gorgeous worth are never, ever determined by the blind, ignorant, toxic people who completely, miserably fail to see it. Take exceptional, beautiful care of yourself today. I will see you in the very next beautiful, empowering video. Goodbye now.